My name is Ed Piscor.
I'm Jim Rugg.
And the guest of honor today, a guy who has had 5, 10, 20 careers, man. Stephen Bissette, first generation Kubert School student. Graduated off to do stuff in heavy metal. Rose to prominence, Swamp Thing.
One of the greatest, probably, monthly comic runs in the history of comics.
One of the greatest collaborations of monthly comics that I could think of, man. Spider Baby Graphics, publisher of Taboo, which printed comics like From Hell. You may have heard of it, man. And 1963, and self-published Tyrant. Steve, thank you for joining us, man.
My great pleasure. Thanks for inviting me on, and I love the programs you guys have done. Great resource and a lot of fun. So,
Steve, that's because you have great taste, sir.
Thank you. We'll see if you still feel that way at the end of the conversation.
I went to the Kubert School in the year 2000, and I went there on the strength to try to find my crew. I wanted to find my Rick Veitch. I wanted to find my John Toddleben, my Tim Truman. You were in class number 1, chicken and egg. How does one discover the existence that there even is a Kubert School?
I was in my second year at Johnson State College, which doesn't exist anymore. I don't know what they're called now. It's still in Johnson, Vermont, but they combine colleges. So if people go Googling, I don't think you'll find Johnson State College anymore. But it was a little college in its own sequestered little campus bubble in Johnson, Vermont. And while I was there, I made a trio of friends who were really into comics. They were the first fellow comic readers that I ever got to spend time with in my young adult life. And it was one of those friends, the late Steve Perry, who was the first comic book collector I ever met. He was the first person I met who had those long white boxes full of comics. He was in his second or third year. He was there for creative writing and literature, was the degree he was after. And one of his independent study projects was writing letters to Marvel Comics and getting his letters published. I mean, that was his goal. So he was the first diehard comic fan I met. And I had two other friends, Jack Vanuker and the late Mark Whitcomb, who also loved comics, but Mark and Jack loved the kind of comics I loved, which were underground comics, Creepy and Eerie magazine, and Steve Perry was into mainstream comics, particularly what was happening in Marvel at the time. And it was Steve who had the subscription to a newspaper called the Comic Buyer's Guide. And there used to be a column in there called Beautiful Balloons. And I remember Steve sitting me down and opening up that week's issue of the Comic Buyer's Guide and pointing to the Beautiful Balloons column announcing that Joe Kubert was going to be opening a school for cartoonists in New Jersey. And Steve went, "You're wasting your time here at Johnson. This is where you need to go." And that column is what prompted my screwing up my courage, writing a letter to Joe and Muriel Kubert, and ultimately applying to the school. It was pretty nerve-wracking. I was a kid from Duxbury, Vermont. I was living in Colbyville, Vermont at the time, working in the family grocery store, pumping gas and selling groceries. And, that was my life. And I had graduated from high school in '73. I was in my second year at Johnson. Who the hell was I, But I did it. I applied. And that same year, 1976, I had also done a comic with those friends, a comic that was bankrolled by another Johnson State College friend, Tim Varick, who we called Doc. And Doc had seen my sketchbooks and liked my artwork, and Doc said, "Look, I'll put up $200 and print anything you want to do." And we did a comic called Abyss, Abyss. It was a one-shot. We only ever did one. And printed it at Johnson Press, the college offset press.
Nice.
And that was my application to the Kubert School, was that issue of Abyss and I had these wash pages. I was working on a comic story called Cell Food that I had adapted from a short story I'd written in a creative writing class in high school. And that's all my application was. Abyss, and I think I had 4 or 5 pages, badly done, badly lettered pages of this thing called Cell Food. And Joe said, "You're just who we're looking for. You're in."
High Eisman would strengthen that lettering once you get there, man. But when you become a student, Rick Veitch, student as well, were you familiar with his underground comics before?
It was Rick's underground comics that were the incentive for daring to write to Joe. I was a huge fan of Two-Fisted Zombies, which Rick's older brother Tom had scripted in collaboration with Rick. So Two-Fisted Zombies, which was part of a Last Gasp comic series of self-standing underground comics, that was in my collection. And I read somewhere, I don't remember where, that the Veitches, Tom and Rick, were from Bellows Falls, Vermont. I knew Bellows Falls, Vermont. You know, it's a shithole. Hell, if they can do it from Bellows Falls, Vermont, I'm from Colbyville. I can do it. So yeah, I was really familiar with only that one thing Rick had done, Two-Fisted Zombies. And who did I meet my first day at the Kubert School? Rick Veitch. And we hit it off. We became like instant friends.
What was that climate like, Steve, whenever you get there? Like, it seems like such an exceptional group that comes out of that first class. Was that from the get-go? Were you guys feeding off each other? Were you having these heady comics conversations, after class and things like that? Like, what do you remember what that environment was like?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm the country mouse, trying to mingle with the city mice. I think part of why Rick and I bonded so quickly is not only were we into a lot of the same stuff, but we were both from Vermont. We were very much out of our element being in Dover, New Jersey. I mean, you went to the school. You got to know Dover as it was when you were there. When we were there, Dover was a New Jersey town really on the skids. The creative environment, though, it was like going to a monastery to become a monk. And the monastery worships comics. Yes, comics. And, we ate, shit, drank, drew, slept comics 24 hours a day. I mean, that was our lives, 24/7. It was amazing. We had a really diverse group of fellow students from all over the country, all of us from different states, towns, cultural backgrounds. We were also really fortunate that one of our classmates was Ben Ruiz, who later was faculty at the Kubert School. Was Ben still there when you were there?
No, the only teachers that I had that you would have probably had would have been High Eisman, like I said, and Erwin Hasen was there. But those are the only two who were there from the earliest generation.
And High and Erwin were there from week one. High was teaching us lettering, and Erwin's was teaching us humor and cartooning. So one of our classmates was Ben Ruiz, and the reason I asked you whether Ben was there or not is Ben stayed on after graduation and became like caretaker for the school and an instructor at the school as well. And the reason I mentioned Ben is Ben was the oldest of us. I believe Ben was in his early 50s. Late 40s, early 50s. He was much more mature than any of us. Ben also pushed us to understand who we were and where we were in the continuity of comics history. Ben was the one who was academically trained. He had been to the Art Students League in New York. He had studied under Andrew Loomis and, the representational illustrative masters. And Ben would sit us down some nights, and what would start as just a friendly conversation would turn into essentially an extended class with Ben, where he would explain that it was comics that had perpetuated the skills that were passed down generation to generation of drawing representationally, drawing the human body, drawing the human anatomy, and that would have all been lost during the modern art movement had it not been for comics. So Ben was really trying to get us to see the big picture, like where did we fit into the big cultural picture? And Ben did it with great passion and energy and had this amazing wealth of wisdom and knowledge that we didn't have. We were kids. I was 21 when I started there. So the creative environment was incredibly fertile. Rick Veitch, classmates like Tom Yates and Kara Sherman Torino and Rick Taylor and myself, we would still be sitting at our drawing desks long after classes were over. And one of the benefits we have that the later classes didn't have is that first year only, Joe Kubert had his drawing studio in the building, in the Baker Mansion. So we also got to, have after hours with Joe. He would get restless in his studio. You'd hear the classical music get turned off, and Joe would come walking into our part of the Baker Mansion classroom with his hands in his pockets usually, and he just wanted to chat. And those were some of the best hours at the Kubert School. We also, if Joe was in the rare mood, he'd let us, as long as we shut up, we could sit in the studio and watch him draw. And that, oh my God, that was just phenomenal. So,
explain the process, man. Like something about inking implements in between every finger, behind his ear.
Oh, you've heard that one. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Joe, the night I remember is Tom Yates was looking through Joe's, Joe had a huge dresser that was like built into the wall. It was part of the Baker Mansion. And he allowed Tom that night to open up the big drawers, and he had all the Hal Foster Sunday pages, printed Sunday pages of Prince Valiant in order. And Tom was lovingly, picking them up and reading Prince Valiant. And I have to share that with you because Tom's drawing Prince Valiant.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And Rick Veitch and I just sort of sat off to the side of Joe's desk and watched him ink 3 covers. And the way it would work is Joe would have I remember as many as 5 sets of penciled covers sometimes. He would, have to go into the city the next day and deliver all these covers. And he would just sit down and he would ink them all in one sitting. We ended up turning in that night. I don't know what time it was, 1, 2 in the morning. Joe had his classical or jazz station on, depending what mood he was in. And I remember watching him ink 1.5 covers. And he had pens and brushes behind each ear and between fingers that he wasn't using to actually manipulate the tools. And he was just snapping those tools down and bang, 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 bang. And Joe had this giant drawing desk with a pane of glass set into one end. That was his little light table, and it was actually built into the desktop as I remember it. And if he put something down he didn't like, it wasn't whiteout he used. He had this roll of white artist tape that he would tear off, put down over the part of the drawing he was going to draw over, and then just draw right over it. And it was amazing. It was just, it was amazing. And he was drawing with both hands that night. I mean, he was working with right and left hand. My memory is the right hand is his primary preference, but he was working with both hands that night. And it was just intoxicating to watch. Amazing. Just amazing.
That is amazing, especially the fact that I think that Rick Estrada was a teacher there at the time as well, right? Yeah. And he was ambidextrous also. So it's you get 2 ambidextrous cartoonist teachers in the room at the same time.
It's unbelievable.
Are you kidding me?
So, I mean, Lee Elias was one of our faculty that first year. It was harder for Lee because he would have to bus in or train in from the city and stay overnight. And Lee was, if memory serves, Lee was the oldest faculty member in terms of his chronological age. So Lee may have been ambidextrous. I don't recall whether he was or not. A lot of the lessons we learned was just being privileged and cursed some days to be part of the flow of their freelance and their personal life, because it was a horrible time in comics. 76, 77, 78, the DC implosion happened, we would have instructors come in tears they'd been crying on the train or the bus in because they'd just been canned at DC. We were getting a real crash course of what a hard time we were entering the industry. But we had optimism too. We were like, I remember our metaphor was like, yeah, we're going to be like those little possum-like prehistoric mammals that ate the dinosaur eggs. We're going to find our ecological niche here. And that really set us up for being strong and relatively daring freelancers, because we were bottom of the food chain. And we were seeing it firsthand with what was happening to our instructors. Even the ones that we perceived as being higher in the food chain. Joe had shown us this whole series of comics he was editing. One by Doug Wildey called Savage World, and there was going to be another one called Panzer by Bob Kanigher and Lee Elias, and Joe had Ragman, which he was doing with Bob Kanigher, and there was a Doug Wildey comic as well. No, Doug Wildey was the one doing Savage World, and Joe was proudly showing us the original art, not as part of class, but between hours or after hours, and all that got canned when the DC implosion went down. All that work that we had seen, the comics we were looking forward to being able to buy off the racks and hold in our hands, never were going to see light of day. Ragman was the only one that ultimately came out. And I think Panzer was published as 1 or 2 issues of Our Army at War, or one of their war titles. The rest of it never saw print. So those were hard lessons we were getting. Those were the lessons that sort of carried more weight for us than the classroom curriculum, the lessons we were getting, during our school hours.
That's the stuff you can't teach in the classroom academically. You have to see that through application. And honestly, like when I went to the school, same deal with me with my instructors. No disrespect to them, but these are people who were drawing coloring books and doing all this stuff that seems super unfun. And it was clear that they really needed that extra $100 or whatever that Joe was giving them a week to do the teaching. Yeah. And I was like, well, I'm just gonna not do what they did. It sort of.
We were drawing for Beaver magazine instead of that, but that's another.
Did Heavy Metal come out when you were in Kubert School?
Yeah, let's get into that. It was thanks to one of my Johnson State College classmates, friends, and roommate for a time, Jack Vanuker. Jack was very aggressively ordering everything that was coming out of France. And when I left our Johnson State College circle to go to Kubert School, Jack gifted me a complete set, up to that point in time, complete set of Metal Hurlant. Okay? Wow. And I had read them as Jack was getting them, right from the first issue. And Jack, I believe, was ordering them from Bud Plant, who I also bought my Underground comics from. But I would have missed Metal Hurlant because that wasn't on my radar, right? I was still, I was reading Arcade, which was sort of the last great hurrah of the Underground comics movement of that time. So Jack really did me a good turn, one of many, turning me on to Metal Hurlant, and he gifted me that set. I still have them to this day. And so I went to Kubert School, and I meet Rick Veitch, and I meet Tom Yates, and Kara Sherman Torino, and Rick Taylor, and Ron Zalmi, and all our classmates. And I'm turning them on to Metal Hurlant. I'm showing them those issues going, look what's going on over in France and Belgium. I mean, this is amazing. And we thought the writing must be incredibly sophisticated because none of us could read French. And it was actually better that we couldn't read French, because later when we actually read the stories, we realized, a lot of this isn't very good science fiction. But that was what led me as a National Lampoon reader to instantly, perk up when I saw that first ad in an issue of National Lampoon that they were going to be launching this new magazine called Heavy Metal. And I recognized the cover, and it was like, oh my God, this looks like, they're reprinting from Metal Hurlant. And sure enough, that's what they were doing. So I was one of the first Americans to set foot in the door at Heavy Metal's offices looking for work. I was in the end of my first year at Kubert School, so this would have been, winter, spring of '77, and I was already putting together my portfolio, getting on the bus from Dover to New York City, lining up as many interviews as I could for a trip, and visiting John Workman in Heavy Metal was one of those interviews. And John liked me. John Workman liked me. He saw something in my work, and he commissioned immediately a one-pager from me. And I cooked it up. It was a crazy one-pager, and delivered it. And John asked for more. And that was the beginning of my freelancing for Heavy Metal.
You currently are a teacher at Center for Cartoon Studies. And just while we're on the academic tip, you were a student at comic book school, essentially one of the first comic book schools. Now you're a teacher at a current one. Can you compare and contrast the student body, the sort of academic structure,
curriculum, expectations?
And bear in mind, what I'm comparing and contrasting probably has nothing to do with the current Kubert School.
Sure.
I'm comparing it to my experience being, part of that first class going through the Kubert School. It's very different generationally. I was coming in the fall of '76. The word graphic novel didn't really exist yet. It certainly hadn't become a market term. The comic book field was going through a major decline. It was getting harder and harder to find places that sold comics. Comic shops were only beginning to become, a marketing force. And I was an odd duck out. Part of why Rick Veitch and I hit it off as friends is Rick was coming in having had his work published by underground publishers. And that's all I wanted to do. I wanted to do horror comics, and nobody was doing horror comics at that time. Creepy and Eerie were still coming out, but that was a pretty closed shop. The DC and the Charlton, quote, mystery, unquote, comics, what they were calling their horror comics line, were pretty tepid and tame. I wanted to be, doing cutting-edge horror in comics at a time when there was nowhere to go and do cutting-edge horror in comics. And the reason I bring that up is a lot of my classmates were looking at the Kubert School as a trade school. We were being groomed to work for DC and Marvel. That was the industry proper. And our proximity to New York City only reinforced that was sort of, those were the plantations we were going to be working at. Those were the coal mines we were going to be going to when we were done. And I really wasn't that interested in that. I was interested in working anywhere I could find a foothold. And my earliest published comics work that would have been available on any newsstand is the backup stories that we did in Sergeant Rock as part of Joe Kubert's work program. But that wasn't my aspiration. My classmates at Kubert School, with the exception of Rick, had their own interests in mainstream comics. We had classmates that loved Wonder Woman and Batman and so on. We had one classmate, Tom Yates, whose aspiration was to draw adventure comics. And Tom has done that. His favorite character was Tarzan. His other favorite characters included Zorro and Prince Valiant, and Tom has ended up doing all of that. But wanting to do adventure comics in 1976 was just as crazy and out of the ballpark as wanting to do horror comics in 1976. So it was more of a trade school setup. We did not have any classes on writing, which was a great frustration for some of us. All of the classes were geared toward drawing, and all the assignments were geared toward learning the skill set that was particular to doing comic books the way they were still being done in 1976, right? You two did that session where you took the World Color comic that Joe Kubert had packaged and that Rick Veitch and I had worked on, and you went through that amazing artifact page by page. Well, that's how comics were done at that time. And that your program with that comic is like a perfect crash course to show anybody who wants to understand how were comic books put together in the mid 70s. Well, that comic that you walked us through is how the comics were being put together at that time. And those were the skill sets we were taught, including lettering, production and design with Kelly Harris, who at that time was married to Jack Harris. Jack Harris being a DC Comics writer and editor. And we were learning, how to do color guides, the color charts, and how to label, the colors appropriately. And those were the skills that served very well a few years later when I ended up becoming part of the team on Swamp Thing. But the stuff that Rick and I were hoping to do was sort of existed apart from those skill sets, if that makes sense to you guys. We wanted to write and draw and paint our own comics, black and white painted, color painted, and that didn't fit any of the templates that were available at that time until heavy metal showed up. Until Scholastic Magazine suddenly became a primary work venue for Joe, doing the stories for Weird Worlds, and then that was a contract that Joe very kindly turned over to me when I graduated in the spring of '78. So anyway, and in terms of your question, contrasting today, the classes I'm teaching, it's a whole different generation. My students, wherever they came from in the world, and we have a very international group of students every single year at the Center for Cartoon Studies, they've grown up with graphic novels. They've grown up with memoir being one of the #1 genres in terms of what sells in graphic novels. Nobody was doing that, in '76. Sam Glanzman had his USS Stevens that Joe had been editing and publishing, his autobiographical comics about serving in the Pacific Theater of War during World War II. And I love that work and, tried to bring it to the attention of my classmates. And Joe really dug that I was into Sam Glanzman's work because Joe loves Sam and Sam's work. But we weren't being taught that. Memoir comics didn't really exist. American Splendor, Harvey Pekar's, was just being self-published by Harvey at that time. So it's very different. The generation now, primarily, they're there to tell their own stories, their own life stories, or metaphoric versions of their life stories in whatever genre, fantasy, or whatever they prefer. I don't think I've had a student yet that really wants to be drawing Batman. Or really, I haven't had a student yet whose aspiration is, I'm going to draw Spider-Man one day. That's what my classmates were into at the Kubert School, by and large. But it's a very different world now. And if I had to sum it up in one word, I would say I'm teaching the Fantagraphics generation.
That's well said.
And when I went to the Kubert School, Joe, Rick, Rick Estrada, Dick Giordano, all our instructors, Lee Elias, they were teaching a generation that had grown up with DC and Marvel comics. Will Eisner was one of our guests at the Kubert School in our first year. He showed up, Joe had invited him in, and Will was being very secretive about this project he was working on, and he said, if this works out the way I want, it's going to change everything. And the project he was talking about was a contract with God. And Will was right. It did change everything.
That's amazing, that timing. Wow. What a historical moment to cross paths with Will Eisner, especially as a student, aspiring to make comics.
And also to see him embarrass Joe in person.
I guess those guys have some history, decades.
Some history. The moment was Kara Sherman, one of my classmates, during the Q&A asked Will, how often do you change your brushes? And Will had this thing stuck behind his ear. We hadn't even recognized it was a brush. It was like this ink-encrusted thing that he had behind his ear. And he pulled it out from behind his ear and he says, I don't know, I've been using this brush for about 2 or 3 years. And we'd been taught we were supposed to change our brushes every, 2 months or something. Well, we were buying our art supplies from the Kubert School.
Right.
Flushed red, it's like Will had just given a mixed message there. one of many that we got from our guests who came in and spoke to us at the school.
Steve, you talk about, this new generation, sort of a Fantagraphics generation, and they're coming from all over the world. Do you see do you look for a Rosetta Stone to try to communicate with them? I'm sure their reading backgrounds are very different and their aspirations are very different. How hard is it to develop a curriculum to suit all of these people and to kind of develop a common language amongst everyone?
Well, the common language is there before they come in the door. We're all, addicted to telling stories with pictures. So the common language is already there. The artifacts differ from student to student, and the interests and the obsessions and the creative paths they're on are very different from student to student. But setting up the common language hasn't been a problem. And I'm going into my 16th year teaching now. I never thought I would be teaching in my life. I don't have a degree in teaching or anything. So the common language is there. What's difficult are things like the classes I don't teach, like production. That's a real hard class to be teaching because the students are coming in with very different levels of experience and sophistication and orientation to the technology of today. So we have students who are old school, the way I still prefer to draw, where they just want to make marks on paper. And we have other students who come in who, know their way around Manga Studio and, Photoshop and everything. And those are the hard classes to establish a common line of work in the classroom, because you're working with students who are practically out of the caves, working with pigments and ink, and you've got other students that are further down the 21st century road than the instructors are. So those are the tough classes. I'd say the only real difficulty I've hit in that common language is I come out of a generation, because of underground comics and because I came of age in the 60s and early 70s, busting taboos was important to my generation, and you didn't pussyfoot around busting taboos. You went for the throat. And we're in a very different age regarding that. There's a lot, it's become a real minefield. What images do you bring into the classroom? Are there going to be trigger images for some of the students? That's where the difficulties lie, in not so much establishing a baseline of conversation as much as being able to pre-identify, okay, this is a bit of a minefield. If I'm going to present something that might be upsetting to some of my students, do I set it up? Do I spring it on them? What are the consequences in either way? That's become the real quicksand, if you will.
And this is higher education. This is people outside of high school. So you have to pussyfoot around adults.
Yeah, that used to matter, but it doesn't anymore. And there are other issues too. As I said earlier, a lot of these students are here intending to tell their own stories. And it's hard to communicate to somebody who's very determined to tell their own story and not cut corners or flinch, that the freedom they're demanding to tell their story is the same freedom that might trigger a panic attack if they see something by a fellow student that is contrary to their comfort zone. So those are the kind of, that's the tough ground right now, right there, and it does get, it's an adventure, let's put it that way. And, I'm the old geezer at the school. I mean, I'm giving a lecture about pre-code horror comics or the underground comics movement, and it's loaded. I mean, that turf is loaded with images that were designed, executed, published, and sold because they're trigger images, because they're upsetting. And hey, I'm the fucking guy that did Taboo.
Right.
But at the same time, one does have to be not just sensitive to those generational shifts, but I also don't want to break trust with them. You know, I don't want to lose a student because of an image that's presented in a lecture. And we're not just talking about the obvious trigger images. You know, how do you teach the work of Winsor McKay, Will Eisner, and Robert Crumb in this current environment when all three of those cartoonists had characters that are definitely racist archetypes in pictorial terms, in the shorthand of cartooning.
Right.
And that's hard. That's difficult.
It's interesting to hear you talk about this, Steve. I had reread your 1995 Comics Journal interview, preparing to talk to you, and there's a lot of talk about censorship at that time, comic shops coming under fire from, parent groups and Christian groups, and these different groups that were looking at comics and saying it's obscene or it's pornographic. And now it feels like, as makers, we are sort of watchdogging over everybody else, each other.
Chilling effect. Shit.
It is. It's interesting to see how that conversation has evolved and where we're at today with it, where it is like the enemy is within in a lot of ways. And enemy is probably too strong of a word for what I'm describing, but it has changed the way we look at this work and who is looking at the work and scrutinizing it. It's fellow cartoonists and readers.
In one way, it's changed, but I think it's also important. One of the classes I teach is essentially our comics history class. It's got a fancy name, Survey of the Drawn Story, but it's comics history class. And in one way, the contours look and feel very different today. But let's not forget that when the Senate subcommittee investigations were happening in the spring of 1954 and being televised, when Milton Caniff and Walt Kelly testified ostensibly on behalf of the Cartoonist Society, Caniff was the one who openly said on the Senate floor, look, a lot of the stuff you consider horrible is quite fascinating. Whereas Walt Kelly gave this speech about, we will not curb expression and freedom of speech. And then when pressed in the interrogation, Walt Kelly said, well, in the National Cartoonist Society, we don't have room for those artists who abuse their skills by doing these kind of comics. And I point out to my students, Walt Kelly's talking about Joe Kubert, Basil Wolverton, all the EC artists, Jack Davis included. A lot of these cartoonists were people, they were tripping over their feet to get into the NCS by the 60s. So in one way, it feels different to us. And of course, every generation just sees the contemporary contours of how the environment functions for us collectively and individually. But when you look back at the history, we've been here before. There were plenty of cartoonists in the 50s that were going, oh, shame. There's a reason Graham Ingalls disappeared teaching painting in Florida. I mean, he and all the EC cartoonists were dealing with a major professional stigma just by association with EC comics. And we forget that, and we also forget that, we have our cultural boogeymen still, like Dr. Frederick Wortham. But when Wortham wrote about fanzines in his book, World of Fanzines, which was published in the early 70s, he singled out Alex Toth as this, intelligent voice in the fanzine culture. And it's hard reading that sentence or two by Wortham, because in my mind, I'm going, yeah, well, Toth was one of the artists you were castigating in the early 50s. And, Wortham was taking a position that a lot of people are sympathetic to today. Wortham was saying, well, corporate culture is dangerous. And as soon as those same creators like Alex Toth were popping up in the fanzines, which is independent, non-corporate, unmeasured self-expression, that Wortham could champion. And for me, it comes down to the schism of, okay, let's talk about our generation, Jim and Ed, So does this mean Rick Veitch's work is okay when it's self-published, but that we should look at all the work he did for Vertigo and DC as being, problematic because it was done for a corporation? It's all a continuity of a single creator's self-expression. So, it's the leanings, the political, the political triggers and the individual Taboos have shifted generationally, but this is something we've seen in every generation of cartoonists and comic publishers and readers.
Steve, if you listen to our interview with Todd McFarlane, he makes the argument that this has been going on, this generational argument, it's been going on since the dawn of man. Caveman days.
Oh, yeah. Todd probably put it very bluntly, so. It's true. You know, there are always people. I remember hearing a poem once, and I've never been able to find it, but there was a poem that I heard once being read aloud that basically said there were certain poems that should not be written. And there are those of us like myself who feel like, no, those are exactly the poems that should be written. As I say, I co-created, co-edited, and co-published a publication called Taboo. Anything that's taboo culturally is important. If it wasn't important, it wouldn't be taboo. And to me, then it's important we really look at it. Let's find a way of wrestling through these taboo subjects. But there are always other parties that are like, no, I don't want that picture in my head, you know. And because we're doing comics, one thing I do tell my students every year is we are far more vulnerable than the creators out there that are busting taboos with their writing or with their music, because it's so easy to take a single picture out of context and remove it from whatever it is you're carefully orchestrating. I mean, Ed, you sent me that recent comic you did where you were like, hey, this is something I would have sent you for Taboo. Man, I could pull a lot of panels out of that story. Really go to town if I wanted to, you know? And comics is really vulnerable to that because it's so easy to just take that one offending image out and go, oh my God, look at what all these things are. Even though you're only showing one cover or one panel, you're presenting an argument, a biased argument or a passionate argument to a group that doesn't read comics. So they're going to take your word for it.
I want to get into Taboo, Steve. I think it's an amazing anthology, the publishing history. There's a lot I want to get into there, but I don't want to skip anything. Can we talk about...
We can do that another time. I'll be here for you again. So.
Well, let's talk about the journey to Taboo. So there's a major stop at DC Comics.
Well, before that, though, and this might happen semi-regularly, I want to bring this up because you touched on it. You mentioned the Scholastic deal that Joe Kubert got. Weird Worlds. There was that magazine that Scholastic did called I think Bananas or something.
Yeah. Bananas was their long-lasting magazine. Weird Worlds was this, short-lived magazine. It was kind of their monster magazine, which is why I loved being part of it. It was actually a Star Wars era magazine. It was right when all the publishers were trying to jump on that that genre wave that went through the pop culture after Star Wars became such a big hit. Scholastic was amazing.
One of the reasons I want to touch on it is because you collaborated on comics with Bob Stein, who goes on to be called R.L. Stein, who was the creator of the Goosebumps line of books. We shouldn't skip over that.
Bob and his wife Jane, Bob and Jane Stein, jovial Bob Stein, as he called himself in his magazines, they were my editors. And the art director up at Scholastic, who I'm still in touch with on Facebook, was this great guy named Bob Feldgus, Feldgus. And it was Bob, Jane, and Bob Stein and Bob Feldgus and Jane Stein, who were the editorial and the production team that I would receive and deliver work to up at Scholastic. Scholastic was phenomenal. They paid the best page rate. They had the best printing and production, even better than Heavy Metals. And they were just wonderful people to work with. They were kind, they were attentive, they wanted your best work, and they made that very clear without ever being authoritarian or territorial about what they were doing. It was probably the most pleasant bullpen I ever set foot in during my freelance years was Scholastic. They were just, I can't say enough good things about them. And they loved when you brought something up that wasn't what they expected. Like, Bob Stein would give me these hand-drawn scripts that were on. He would write on that kind of tablet paper that they give you in first and second grade that has the chunks of wood in it still.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that.
And he would do the scripts in pencil, and it was like those thick lead pencils that you got in first and second grade. And they were drawn. They weren't written. I never got a typed script from Scholastic. And they were stick figures. So Bob would, he would have it all. Let's say it's a 3-page story. The Villagers' Victory, the first story I did for Joe, and that was signed by the Kubert School. That script was a 3-page hand-drawn stick figures with the handwritten captions and balloons, and that's what I worked from. And so Bob was putting down these little monster stories, and they were all very goofy. The Villagers' Victory, the first one I drew was, a count who I was told to draw like a vampire, is being threatened by the villagers coming up to the castle with torches, but he's being protective of his kids. He wants to make sure his kids escape okay. And it turns out his son and daughter are werewolves, the end, right? Every story was that kind of set it up, play against what it looks like's happening, and a little twisteroo at the end. And when I came back with the pencils and gave them to Joe, Joe looked at it and went, I don't know if this is what they want. Because the way I approached it was, they took my comic books away when I was in grade school. I'm going to draw the best monster comic I possibly can for the kid I was, right? So I made it look like a Hammer movie from Hammer Films, And the count was, Boris Karloff was my model. And when the kids turn into a werewolf, they look like that Bernie Wrightson werewolf from Swamp Thing, And so I went to town, and Joe was a little nervous. And he called me in the next day, and he said they loved it. And that's how it was working with Scholastic. I would get the scripts, and I made it the best, scariest monster comic I possibly could. And Bob Stein would just go, "This is great." That's what he wanted. And then I was very aware of Bob's work, and I definitely remember seeing in a bookstore the first or second Goosebumps, and seeing the name R.L. Stein and thinking, could it be? And I turned around the book, and there was the photo of Bob, and it's like, yep, there he is. So I don't know. It would take somebody grounded in publication specific to school distribution, which isn't either you two guys or me. And I don't know any comic collectors that are into that work. I know comic collectors that love Howard Cruz was a very dear friend, and God bless him, he passed away earlier this spring. Howard was doing work in Scholastic, so I know there's Howard Cruz collectors that have gone back and tried to get their hands on everything Howard did for Scholastic and for Fangoria with his Count Fangor comic and everything. I know there's collectors of my work that will pop up and ask if I'll sign, an issue of Weird Worlds that they have or something. But I don't know of anybody who's done a history of Scholastic publishing, and I think that's long overdue, especially that they are now the mainstream of comics publishing in America.
Yeah, it's such an interesting history. You're right, too. The little seen or little known, we don't think about it when we think of comics history, and it's such a rich piece of it.
I have a graphic novel in my collection that I will dig out, and I'll email you the info when I lay hands on it. They published an original paperback and hardcover graphic novel around 1979 or 80. And it's not under the Scholastic imprint. They had another imprint name they created for this publication. But it is a brilliant lost graphic novel. It is amazing. And they didn't know what to do with it. In fact, the copy I have was given to me by Bob Stein and Bob Feldgis because they were like, Steve, we just did this and we thought you would dig it. And I was like, wow, is this going to be in bookstores? And I remember Bob Stein saying, we're not sure what to do with it, And I've never seen that graphic novel mentioned or written up ever. And yet, Jeff Smith and Bone becomes part of Scholastic's lineage. And most people look at that as the ground zero of Scholastic publishing graphic novels. It's not, So that is a much overdue history that somebody should undertake. Maybe you too.
We'll get our investigative reporter caps on.
Okay. I will get my hand. I've still got that book, And
Yeah, I'd be
they
curious
might-
about it.
And if you want, it's something we could do. Going through it page for page, because it is
That'd be
a
sick.
phenomenal piece of work. And I don't recall the creator because I don't remember ever seeing their work anywhere else again, unfortunately.
I do want to let the audience out there know that if they want to see some of the stuff that you did for Scholastic with Bob Stein, dig in the quarter bins, dig in the back issue bins for Eclipse's Fear Book, and you'll get a nice sample of that material.
It's Fear Book, and there was also a comic that Steve, forgive my brain fart. There was a second collection that came out as well in comic book form, and Tom Yates did the cover for it. It's got all these monsters around a campfire, and that reprints some of the Scholastic material that wasn't in the Eclipse Fear Book, as well as one of Rick Veitch's stories as well. Because Rick Veitch, Tom Yates, they also did comic work for Scholastic around that time. Not as much as I had ended up doing, but they did a couple.
Steve, how did that? You talk a lot about copyright becomes a big part of your history, and how did this stuff go from Scholastic to Eclipse? Was that something that Scholastic handled, or
I packaged it and I reached out to Bob and Jane at Scholastic, and they said, "Go ahead, we don't care." They didn't accept payment or anything, and to this day, it's kind of in a limbo because. All that work I did for Scholastic, they never had me sign a single contract.
wow?
Right? So I would never reprint that work without tracking down Bob, Jane, Suzanne Lord, who also was a freelancer, or Suzanne might have been on staff at Scholastic. I was never clear on that. It wasn't my business. But I drew at least one or two scripts that Suzanne Lord wrote at that time. And so, they co-own the copyrights as far as the legality of it's concerned. But I would not put together a reprint without tracking each of them down. I did get in touch with Bob Stein a number of years ago, and Bob was happy to hear from me, and we exchanged a couple emails. But it sort of got stuck in that limbo of, we should do something new. And it's like, I'm like, yeah, but let's reprint our old stuff first, And we never got to the next stage of that. It wasn't pressing at the time. But I would certainly love, and I've even approached reps from Scholastic. They're not aware of that body of work, and they have no interest in it, as far as I can tell. Because obviously, to my mind, that work would make a natural reprint as a Goosebumps comic collection.
Oh yeah.
But if they don't if they don't harbor the interest in it, and it's in this contractual limbo, I'm not sure how to proceed. Oh, well.
That's such a tough piece of comics history, I think, for a lot of cartoonists. These projects that, so many of these indie publishers go out of business, and these projects end up in weird limbo, especially if they're collaborative.
1963, case in point.
We'll get there.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
By way of Swamp Thing, I guess. I mean,
and also, you asked me about 1941.
There it is.
This will never be reprinted, as far as I know. Who owns it? It was an adaptation published by Heavy Metal and Pocket Books of a film that was co-produced and co-released by Universal and Columbia. I can't imagine what the legal nightmare would be of clearing the rights to do a reprint of 1941. And if you did clear the rights, what would you print from, right? Does Heavy Metal have the film? Does any digital production process use film the way we used to do color comics, where you'd get the separations, and that became the film, the negatives from which the plates were burned? I don't know, and that's part of the limbo as well. How do you reproduce this older work if you do either clear the rights to reproduce it, or in the case of all the Steve Ditko volumes, you don't care about clearing the rights for reproducing it. You just presume that's public domain, we're going to put it out. So you've got a variety of publishers scanning from old comics. You've got some that are trying to track down original art. It's a real quandary.
Because you showed that copy of 1941, I'm going to toss you a Barbara Walters softball question and ask, did Steve Spielberg ever see that comic, and what did he think?
I believe you know the answer to that question.
But the audience might not.
Well, there's a letter that was sent to Julie Simmons, who was the editor or publisher at Heavy Metal at that time. And Spielberg was very unhappy with our comic of 1941. He, in a paragraph, said we were savagely talented, Rick Veitch and Steve Bissette, but that we had turned his nice domestic family comedy into a Hieronymus Boschian cannibalistic nightmare.
That's fucking awesome.
That is.
The reason we did it, though, is might be of interest to you. We were contracted to do an adaptation of a movie that we weren't allowed to see. We weren't allowed to have pictures from. We weren't allowed to have the shooting script from. We were supposed to adapt a forthcoming big budget blockbuster dual studio movie under conditions that were insane. The rep from the two studios who showed up at the heavy metal offices, and Rick Veitch and I got a phone call from John, our art director, and John said, guys, could you come into the city? We'll reimburse you for your travel expenses. The rep is going to come in and give you the reference materials to draw the graphic novel. This guy had slides, the old 35 millimeter slides that would go on a slide carousel. And he thought we would sit in a room and they would project the slides and we would do all the sketches we needed to do to then go back to Vermont and do this 64-page full-color painted adaptation of their movie. John Workman talked the guy into going for lunch. And he said, okay, we'll get Rick and Steve into a room and we'll have them do what they needed to do. And as soon as the guy was out of the building, John said to his brother, Bill, who also worked in the art department at Heavy Metal, take these downstairs, make photostats for Steve and Rick to take back to Vermont. The studio were like, whatever we give you guys to do this, you're going to be down the street at Time Magazine selling the story. And we were like, we're under contract to do this work with you. Like, we're not going to bust ranks. You know, this was a big job, big breakthrough for Rick and I. And it was this weird adversarial relationship the whole way. Rick finally got his hands on a copy of the shooting script. And because Alan Asherman, who was doing the adaptation, had fallen behind schedule, Rick ended up doing a lot of the writing for at least the last third, if not more, of the graphic novel, working from the script. And what was funny is that the movie script was genuinely hilarious. I mean, it was laugh out loud funny to read at times, and the movie was not. We were invited to the New York City premiere of 1941. I hasten to add that other than Peter Laird and Kevin Eastman inviting Rick, myself, our family members, you know, to go to the premieres in Northampton, Massachusetts of the two or three of the Turtle movies, it was the only premiere of anything I was connected with in comics I was ever invited to. And we were excited, you know. Rick and I got as dressed up as two guys from Vermont are ever going to get. You're looking at it right now. A lot of flannel, you know, denim.
Respect.
And we showed up at the big Broadway or Times Square theater where the preview was, and we had our preview tickets, and we went in and sat down, and the movie began, and you could just feel the oxygen sucking out of that room. By 20 minutes into the movie, everybody in that theater knew this isn't working. This isn't funny. And nobody talked to each other on their way out of the theater. And I remember Rick and I getting out in the street and looking at each other and going, well, there goes our career, you know. You know, it was all done under these very weird work circumstances. Plus, Rick and I were living separately in Grafton, Vermont. We both lived in cabins that had no running water. My cabin had no electricity. We had outhouses to really make it visceral for your viewers and listeners. And that's where we did the whole of 1941. When we got the job done, we had all the pages laid out on the floor of the brick schoolhouse that I was living in Grafton. And we laid them all out on the floor. And these are pages that we had done with watercolor, color pencil, Dr. Martin dyes, all the collage elements. And my landlord's dog, Banjo, came running in to my cabin because we had left the door open. and he had just come across the stream, and he shook off. And Rick and I because suddenly there's spots of water on all of our color pages, right? And we had to doctor, I would say, half the pages.
Wow.
To try to repair them. And, poor Banjo. Banjo comes in all happy to see us, and both of us are going, "Wah!" So, yeah, those were the sort of caveman-like conditions under which 1941 was realized.
That's unbelievable. It's such a good-looking book. Like, it's shocking to hear that.
Hey, we did our best. I mean, we almost killed each other. I was always behind. Rick, I have two friends, Rick Veitch and Tim Truman, who have never missed a deadline in their lives, as far as I know. And they're both workaholics. And I am Mr. Hippy Dippy Flake, And there I was, freshly moved from living in New Jersey for 2.5, almost 3 years, back in Vermont. And all I wanted to do was walk around in the woods and take mushrooms and, And Rick was like, Bissette, get to work. Somewhere in my files is a drawing that Rick left on my door. Well-deserved drawing. Of Rick holding me up by the throat, smashing my face with a flat iron, because he had bicycled over to my house and I wasn't home. I was out in the woods walking around that day, So, but we got through it and we got it done, and then we redid it after Banjo's visit.
That's amazing. You mentioned Tim Truman, and Rick Veitch, both guys who go on and do some indie work, self-published work outside of that Marvel DC model. I think that's really interesting. Like when I think of that early Kubert School group, I think of you guys and I think of all of these sort of outside the box thinking in terms of doing your own work, finding publishing outlets or audiences beyond, say, the direct market.
Yeah, we had to. I mean, we found any available perch or venue. And Rick and Tim in particular, they were shifting much easier than any of us between indie work. I mean, there's Tim doing Scout, and then he meets Gardner Fox, the great Gardner Fox, toward, sadly, what ended up being toward the end of Gardner's life. Gardner Fox, for those of you listening or watching or both, Gardner Fox was one of the Golden Age and Silver Age writers for DC Comics in particular. Tim ended up doing Hawkworld, based on a concept Gardner Fox had, but never got to realize before he had passed away. So Tim and Rick both were, their careers are amazing that they're shifting from indie self-published or creator-owned work to working with DC time and time again. Tim has done a lot of work for DC in particular, and Rick as well. Rick scripted Aquaman, The Question, et cetera, et cetera. And Rick also was doing graphic novels as well as series for Vertigo. So they had, because they're so professional and because they're so reliable, they were able to traffic in all waters with greater ease than people like myself or Tom Yates or some of our other classmates, because just because they are such consummate professionals.
Well, you're not without a sizable piece of history at DC with your Swamp Thing work, and I guess maybe you were the first of that group to really go to DC and make a giant mark. Well,
Tom Yates was the one that did Swamp Thing before we were on the book.
Yeah, he started the series.
Yeah, and I know that for many years, primarily because of the collaboration with Alan Moore and the prominence that Alan Moore so quickly and justifiably achieved, the work that Tom Yates and Martin Pascoe did on Saga of the Swamp Thing's first 15 issues has often been overlooked. But it's interesting now that work's back in print, that there is a strong fan following for all the other little narrative arcs and collaborative creative arcs throughout the history of the Swamp Thing character. Sorry, I had to rush to Tom's defense there for a second.
Yeah. No intent to throw Tom Yates under the bus or forget him. But
I mean, and I appreciate your saying that. I mean, John Toddleben and I were invited to work on the book. it wasn't a shoe-in. We had to do an audition. Len Wein was the editor. We weren't going to land that gig unless Len liked our work. But it was Tom that set that up, and it was Marty Pasco who, along with Len Wein, made the decision as well. So we were very much coming in following Tom's footsteps. And if you look at our early issues, as the companies often do, they kept Tom Yates, the original artist on that series, on to do the covers for a number of issues, because they wanted to have that transition look seamless to the casual comic reader. That they still wanted Swamp Thing to reach a larger audience, but they wanted the continuity that it still looked like the comic that Marty Pasco and Tom Yates had been doing since 1981, 82.
It's one of the exciting things of that run for me, you and John's work, is I don't know any other comics that look like that, before or after. It's a very unique style that you guys bring to that book, and fits horror perfectly.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I had a love-hate relationship with that rectangle. You guys know that rectangle, we sit down at our drawing board, and most print comics in our culture are that rectangle. 10 by 15 was the size of it when I was working on Swamp Thing. And I hate that rectangle. And I hate that grid. One of the possible aesthetic clashes I might have had but didn't have is later I read Alan. I've always stayed on top of reading Alan Moore's work right to this day. And Alan clearly understands and loves the grid, the stability, and the metronomic rhythms that are possible by sticking to the 9-panel grid or the 6-panel grid or the 12-panel grid or what have you. And I would argue that Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen is a testimonial to the power of that rectangle and the comics grid, being able to orchestrate it almost like music. I fucking hated it. I hated it. I'd been working in comics by that time I'd been working professionally in comics for a little over 5 years. And I'd done a fair amount of work. And I had always experimented with what was possible with the layout of the page. And part of that was Joe Kubert was my mentor. And if you look back at Joe Kubert's comics, Joe also was always very adventurous about what was possible on the comic page. Joe was a master of layout and design, never losing the thread of storytelling. And that was a discipline and an adventurism that Joe tried to instill and pass on to those of us who were fortunate enough to be in his classroom. To me, I took it on as an aesthetic. Like, to me, when you open a comic book, whatever that first page is has an emotional impact on you. And to me, every time you turn the page, there's a graphic power to the page. Everything about it also is an emotional connection. And when I'm working in a genre I'm passionate about, particularly horror comics at that time when I was working on Swamp Thing, breaking that rectangle, breaking that grid had an emotional power to it of shattering the emotional stability and the preconceptions that the reader was bringing to their reading of the comic. And, I was always looking for ways to push that envelope. And I'm talking in first person here because since I was penciler on the book, I was getting the scripts, and it was my job to break it down in pencil form. And John Tottleben, who I was partnered with on Swamp Thing, was doing the inks. But I was the one primarily responsible for that translation from script to the comic page. And that was the chemistry Len Wein wanted us to work with, because John Tollivan and I, when we turned in our samples, and you can see some of those sample pages in that new Absolute Swamp Thing Volume 1, that big hardcover that they put out late last year. We gave Len Wein 2 sets of samples. We did one sequential sequence that John penciled and I inked, and we did another sequential 2 or 3 page sequence that I penciled and John inked. And Len looked at it and went, right, Steve's the penciler, John's the inker. And part of it that Len responded to, Len liked that aspect of the work I was turning in, was that I was really busting open what was possible on the page. Part of it was, impatience and restlessness. Part of it was that anger I just expressed to you about the rectangle. And part of it was, to me, certain genres function in particular ways in different media. And without getting too academic about it, one of the hurdles that Tom Yates faced, my classmate from Kubert School, in wanting to do adventure comics, is Tom was in love with the adventure comics of the comic strip era, where those Sunday pages were huge. The Sunday comics used to be gigantic, oversized pages. And there's a reason that adventure comics by Alex Raymond and Hal Foster and so on went through a golden age, because that's a big canvas to work on. And it's physically large enough that you can lose yourself in that space. Comic books, what they had become by 1977, 76, 78, weren't inviting to a genre like adventure, right? They had gotten claustrophobic. The printing had gotten shoddier. You guys have talked about, the artifacts of the printing process when they switched from metal plates to plastic plates. Fine line work would start to get wavy, because the plastic plates are literally melting given the speed of the press, right? The plastic plates, the integrity of the line begins to break up or waver because the speed of moving that much paper through a press that's got the plastic printing plate on the roller is losing the integrity of the line. Okay, too bad for Tom and Adventure Comics, but I looked at what was going on and I thought, this is perfect for horror comics. It's claustrophobic, it's a tight little space, it's like being buried alive in this story. And so for me, the page design, how I laid out the panels, how I would shift panels, whether I used a ruler on the panel borders or I hand drew the panel borders, all these things were part of my toolkit of distressing and disturbing the reader. That was my goal, right? And that was my aesthetic of busting open what was possible in comics. The other thing I'll mention is, when John Tollivan and I first got the phone call from Len Wein that there was a new writer on the book, and it was somebody we'd never heard of, Alan Moore. And John and I both, Len was surprised that we both went, oh, we know Alan's work, because we had been buying Warrior magazine. Warrior was the publication out of England that was published and edited by Des Skin, who's still with us. And Alan was doing Marvel Man, which became Miracle Man when it was reprinted in America, and V for Vendetta. And we'd been reading Warrior for, I think, 2 years at that point. So we knew Alan's work, and we loved his work, and we were enthused. And the reason I bring this up is we immediately started exchanging these long letters. 1982, 83, there's no internet. We can't afford phone calls to England. So putting letters in the post was the way that Alan Moore, John Tollivan, and myself communicated by and large. And then John and I would talk on the phone. Right off the bat, Alan and I found this common ground in that we both loved the films of certain directors, specifically Nicholas Roeg. And the films I would steer you guys to and your listeners and viewers to are Walkabout, Don't Look Now, and The Man Who Fell to Earth. Those were the three Nicholas Roeg films that Alan and I, in our letters, talked about a few times. And that's what we were trying to do in Swamp Thing. And what Nicholas Roeg would do is he would not tell a story in a linear fashion, beginning, middle, end. He told a story from the outside in. It becomes like a set of mosaic tiles. And the climax or the emotional peak of many Nicholas Roeg films might be an incident that in chronological linear time actually happens in the middle of the narrative. But the tapestry of the film reshapes the narrative to bring you to that emotional peak. That's what Alan and I were into. And if you look back at some of those Swamp Thing stories we did, that's the kind of experimentation with what was possible on the comic page we were working for.
Every page, every issue had some different kind of storytelling technique that you guys were getting across, and playing around with different kinds of foreshadowing and all kinds of stuff. Now, we're on the Cartoonist Kayfabe YouTube channel, and Kayfabe is a pro wrestling term that involves kind of like the illusion of the craft. And the Alan Moore script is legendary. Very verbose, voluminous. 10 pages written for one panel kind of thing. Can you shed some light on that, man? Can we break kayfabe? Was it a true collaboration, Marvel method? Like, how did things work?
The reason you use two words in describing Alan's scripts, and that tends to be how I hear people talk about them. But the fact of the matter is this: Alan wrote those scripts in a very conversational way, and they were essentially a letter to the artist he was working with. They were very chatty, right? And Alan would let you know at the beginning of a script what he was trying to set up, either for the end of the story or the next issue or whatever. So part of the length of some of those narrative descriptions of what was going to happen in a panel or a page was Alan talking conversationally to you, the artist who's drawing from the script, as to what it was he was looking for. We only found out during our first personal trip to Northampton, England. John Toddleman and I got to go over to visit Alan 2 or 3 times. Once we got to go with our wives, John's wife, Michelle, and my first wife, Marlene, as well. We didn't know that Alan had been doing little thumbnails and putting them up on the wall in front of his typewriter. So he was laying out each issue, right? We never saw those. And Alan said, well, I don't want you to see those because I don't want to box in your imagination. I don't want to tell you what to do. So his written scripts are lengthy because he was giving you a verbal description of a very clear picture Alan had in his mind of how this story is going to be told visually. And one of the things that was so dramatic about working with Alan is, by that time, 1982, 83, I had worked from scripts by many, many, many writers, from Bob Stein, who we talked about earlier, to 1 or 2 Bob Kanigher scripts, to I got to work with Archie Goodwin at one point. Alan's scripts were more visual than anybody's. And you could tell when you read the script, he understood the language of comics, the vocabulary, the syntax, the grammar, the potential, the power, the pitfalls. Alan understood it in a way that very, very, very few writers I got to work with prior or even after understood how comics worked. So those scripts by Alan were so detailed because he had such a clear picture in his head of the entire scope of not just the issue, but where he was going next or where he was thinking about going next. And he wanted it to fit that big map in his head. Also, Alan would always defer to the artist. He would describe an effect he was thinking of, and he would lay it all out panel to panel, and then he would often end a page or a sequence saying, unless you have a better idea, whatever you think is best. I can honestly say the only time I really deviated in a dramatic fashion from an instruction Alan gave me, he was right, I was wrong. Other times, though, when I deviated, Alan loved where it went. I was the one that had the idea of when we did the Rites of Spring issue, where it's Alan comes up with this day in the swamp where Alec Holland, Swamp Thing, figures out how to consummate the relationship with Abby Cable, his girlfriend, by giving her this potato off his back, and she eats it, and she trips, and they can come together in the green, this other realm, the vegetable realm. I was the one that had the idea as I was reading a script, if I can lay this out so that the trip has to be read sideways, right? And so I designed that, there was a double-page spread, and I designed it so that you almost unconsciously would turn the comic because the artwork and the placement of the balloons were going to pull your eye so that you had to turn the comic. And then it didn't go back to holding a comic book in a normal way until they came out of the trip. Unfortunately, there was a Reese's Pieces ad in the middle of it. But those were the kind of things that I would experiment with. And Alan always was very, not just supportive, but he loved it when he would finally see it. And he didn't see what we were doing until, I would snail mail photocopies of my pencils to Alan so he could see the work that was being done at the same time that John was inking it. And it was hard to maintain that. I mean, Alan's in England, John Toddleben's in Erie, Pennsylvania. I was living in Wilmington, Vermont. And all we had to work with, because we couldn't afford FedEx or UPS, except when we were sending pages to our editor at DC, when they paid for it, we were just using snail mail. So it would take a while for stuff to get around. We didn't have the tools you guys have of, let's say you two are collaborating on something and you can't get together. Ed, you could pencil something, scan it or photograph it, fire it off to Jim, and you guys could have a conversation about it within 10 minutes. We were waiting days and sometimes a week until one or the other had seen the work we had done.
Feels like pretty slim margins to get a monthly comic done under those kinds of conditions.
Oh yeah, and we were always behind the 8 ball. When we started on the book, it was behind schedule. When Alan got on the book, it was behind schedule. When I was working on the book, I had not one, but both of my kids were born at home. I fell further behind schedule. It would take me, at the best of times, 4.5 to 5 weeks to pencil an issue of a monthly comic. Do the math. The problem child, right? So it was really hard. And in the midst of all that, we're also trying to coordinate all these moving parts and getting them to one another. Because the thing that a lot of people don't realize today is the way comics were assembled at that time. The script would be mailed from England to New York City, to Len Wein, and then when she took over as of issue 25, Karen Berger. They read the script. Once they approved it, it was then mailed to Steve Bissette in Wilmington, Vermont. I would pencil the pages. I drove both my editors nuts by penciling out of order, which they hated, but I was approaching the script like a Nicholas Roeg film. And if there was something that had to resonate at the beginning and end, I would either pencil those pages first or last, depending on how much work I was going to pour into those particular visuals. Then I would FedEx the pencil pages to my editor in New York. They then had to get them to John Costanza in New Jersey, the letterer. And then once John Costanza finished, he either shipped or hand-delivered them to New York again, and then the editor would mail them or FedEx them to Erie, Pennsylvania. Then John Tottleben, as he finishes pages, has to FedEx them back to New York City, where Tatiana Wood, the colorist, would pick up the photocopies of the pages and do the coloring guides. All of this had to happen in 4 weeks' time.
And you're a student of the Kubert School, and Joe Kubert, he would pound the gavel talking about deadlines and 10 classes a week. You gotta turn in your assignments or you'll get kicked out. So was there an extra pressure, or you just did what you could?
Have that conversation with Rick Veitch. I just went through, because I'm moving stuff around in my basement and my old flat files and stuff, and I just found one of my envelopes of Kubert School assignments, and there's a ton of work in there. Rick remembers me never having assignments done. I can see the evidence of the assignments being done, and Joe never would have given me work on the Heroes World catalogs, the backup stories of Sergeant Rock, et cetera, if I hadn't made enough of my class deadlines that Joe trusted me to do that work. But I can't say Rick's wrong. I'm sure I found layouts, thumbnails on tracing paper over Bristol board of a Dick Giordano assignment, and I look at that and go, I guess I didn't finish that assignment. So Rick's right, but I also go through there and I find a lot of finished work, including one or two that are going to see print in the next year or so. A couple of friends of mine, one of whom is Mort Todd and Scott Shaw are going to do a book commemorating Steve Ditko's Gorgo comic, Joe Gill and Steve Ditko's Gorgo comic from the Silver Age. And I found my original Dr. Martin Dye colored recreation of one of Ditko's Gorgo pages. That was one of our assignments. We had to pick a favorite page from a comic book we had loved and redraw it. And I don't remember whose class it was for. I suspect it was Joe's, but I'm not sure. And it's a pretty cool Gorgo page, you know? And it's not just, you know, penciled, inked, lettered. It's colored as well. So I guess I got some work done.
Steve, you mentioned Karen Berger coming on to Swamp Thing, and in my mind, she's sort of a very important editor historically. I wonder what your experience was like with her. Did she strike you as somebody that, you know, really knew her business at that time or had a vision as an editor? Or was she just kind of handling deadlines? Like any Karen Berger stories?
Oh, lots of them. And Karen, I'm sure, has tons of stories about me. I drove Karen nuts. You know, I was not the reliable, rock steady professional that Rick and Tim are. However, I first met Karen when she was editorial coordinator at DC Comics. She had a position of sort of being traffic cop for moving pages and issues through DC. And the first book I remember Karen editing was House of Mystery, I think. We can double check that. But I remember getting a script from Karen that turned out it was written by a friend of mine, Bill Kelly, who was a friend of Joe Kubert's and a friend of the Kubert School. And I ultimately mailed the script back to Karen because I got a really good paying gig from Marvel Comics on another job, and I turned down the story. And I wish I'd drawn it. It was a great little story about a cat that is a shapeshifter. But Karen and I, you know, we're on good terms. I didn't screw up the deadline or anything. She sent me the script. I read it. I began doing layouts, and then another job offer came up. And Karen was very diffident, like, well, you know, you got to go where the work is. Keep me in mind. I'll keep you in mind. When we started work on Swamp Thing, with Karen taking over in Len's shoes, two things struck me immediately. And Karen is one of the 3 or 4 best editors I've ever had the good fortune to work with. I would rank Joe Kubert, Archie Goodwin, Karen Berger, and Chris Duffy as the 4 editors I have felt the most fortunate to work with in my career. And Len saw you as a pair of hands, right? Len had been working professionally in comics. He was a fan and an artist in fanzines. He came into the comic book field as a working professional as part of the same generation that friends like Marv Wolfman, his friends like Marv Wolfman entered the field. And Len had drawn as well as written comics in the fanzine era. So Len kind of saw us as his pair of hands. And the example I'll give you to make that concrete is there was a Batman cover that Len wanted somebody to draw. And I don't know who had tried to do it before me, but Len contacted me and said, Steve, I need this Batman cover and I need it really quickly. Can you do it? And I was always pretty much on top of the cover deadlines with Swamp Thing. And I said, sure, I'll give it a shot. And Len had this very specific picture in his head, but he could not articulate it. And I ended up sending in like 6, 7, 8. And they weren't just roughs. I was doing like full marker sketches with gray tone markers and everything. So I was doing, you know, a pretty comprehensive, tight drawing. And after 10 of these, Len's still, you know, he'd ring me up exasperated, like, this isn't quite right. And I finally went, Len, I don't know what the picture is you have in your head, but as an artist, I've done you 10 drawings and I'm still not there. I pass. You know, I don't want to kill for you or anything, just, you know, I'm not your guy. And Len ended up doing it with John Totleben. And I remember John telling me at the time, yeah, I still didn't get whatever it was Len had in his head. You know, the deadline came up. John did a painting. It was a variation on one of the design versions I had done, but I can't say John saw my designs. He was working from the same sort of strange description Len had given me as well. Karen wasn't like that. Karen was not a micromanager. She did not try to make you do it a certain way. And Karen once said to me, point blank, Steve, an editor is a paid friend. You know, my job is, this is Karen speaking, and I'm paraphrasing, that, you know, her job, my job, was to stay on your friendly side and get the best work out of you I can. And that's a pretty good description of, you know, a solid editor. Karen just wanted our best work, and she knew it when she saw it, and she knew it when she didn't see it. And she would call you on it if it was falling short. I don't remember having many my adversarial relationship with Karen was always around deadline, and Karen was great. I mean, she got her best work out of me. I have to say, also, putting on my self-analyst cap for a moment, I worked for my dad from the time I was born until I was 21. And, you know, all of us, you guys as freelancers, you know this, we all have these sort of employee-employer tapes that we play in our head, you know? And we're projecting all these roles onto the people we work with. And editors are like big blank projection screens. And any of my baggage with an employer based on the psychological and emotional nuances of having worked for my father, who was a military man, didn't work with Karen Berger. And I think that's part of why she got the best work out of me, you know? Karen was great to work with. I drove her nuts. I confess it then. I confess it today. But she got some of the best work I ever did in my life out of me. And we didn't get to work together again. And I think part of it was Karen didn't want to go back into that, you know, tar baby of dealing with crazy Bissette. But part of it also was Karen and I had become friends. When Joe Kubert passed away, Rick Veitch and I made the drive down with Rick's wife, Cindy Leschak, to New Jersey to attend Joe's funeral. Joe was like a second dad to us. And who's at the funeral but Paul Levitz and Karen? And Karen made sure that Rick, Cindy, and I had lunch with Paul because she wanted to use that moment that we were all there because of Joe to get us together. That's a friend, you know, because we had a lot of access to going with Paul Levitz. And at that day, at that moment, it didn't matter anymore. And Karen was the one that made sure we all got together and had that. So I just want to make it clear that, you know, Karen was more than an editor to a lot of us. And I've got friends like Rick Veitch who had very close working relationships with Karen that lasted years beyond the relationship Karen and I had professionally. But I also have friends who called Karen the Dragon Lady. You know, I had friends that had horrible impressions of Karen. And when they would describe to me events that led to that caricature, I couldn't argue with them, but I'd never had an experience like that with Karen. Karen was always great with me, even when I was at my worst.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad I asked. It's a beautiful story about Joe Kubert's, you know, funeral and her bringing you all together.
Well, let me also put on my history professor hat for 2 sentences. I would also argue that Karen is one of the most important editors in comics in terms of how people are looking back now and trying to see how women fit into the history of what was long a male-dominated profession. And I would point to Helen Mayer, who was the editor-in-chief and vice president at Dell Comics, as the historical predecessor to what Karen became at DC, particularly once Karen launched the Vertigo line. So to me, there's a historical continuity of Helen Mayer overseeing the whole of the best-selling North American comic book publisher for the majority of the 20th century. And the next very powerful visionary woman to step into those shoes was Karen Berger. And we all know the Vertigo legacy one way or another. And we're still feeling it today. And now Karen's launching a brand new imprint at another publishing house. So I'm really curious to see where that goes.
Yeah, we need to get her on the channel and sit down with the chat.
Yeah. I had early professional interaction with Karen Berger that was all great, but not very close. I worked much closer with Shelley Bond, who was an editor at Vertigo
Right.
under Karen at that time, which was also a great experience. But Karen is, as you say, you know, such a historical figure. So I'm glad to hear some stories about her. Helen Mayer is a new name for me, Steve.
Yeah.
When was she active?
Oh, God. Well, Helen Mayer started, I mean, I'll boil this all down. I mean, in a nutshell, Dell Comics with the Dell logo was originally a partnership between 2 entities. There was Western Publishing and Litho that was based in Racine, Wisconsin, and there was Dell Publishing. And the partnership was that Western did all the creative and editorial work. They were packaging the comics. Dell was publishing the comics. the licenses that we associate with Dell Comics, like the Disney cartoons, the Warner Brother cartoons, the MGM cartoons, that was all Western Litho and Publishing that oversaw those licenses. And that's why when Dell and Western broke away from one another in the spring of 1962, and Western launched Gold Key Comics, and Dell now had to try to keep going in the comic book market, but they no longer had that powerhouse editorial partnership that they had so long thrived under. Dell really floundered. And by the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, Dell was less than a shadow of the dynamo they had been. Helen Mayer worked with Dell, not Western. So Helen Mayer was someone who came in working as an assistant and then an editor, and she eventually became editor-in-chief and vice president of Dell Publishing. She was the one working with Marjorie Buell, the creator of Little Lulu. She was the one working with, Western Publishing all during those years. And she was the one overseeing Dell when the Senate subcommittee hearings occurred in the early 1950s. And Helen Mayer was one of the few publishers who stood up against the outrage that was being voiced concerning comic books in 1952 to 1954. In fact, Helen Mayer orchestrated the campaign that Dell successfully pulled off of making sure that Dell and Western did not subscribe to the Comics Code Authority, and they sold the American public on that Dell seal that appeared in the upper corner of every one of their comics, meaning wholesome comics. And they didn't have to knuckle down under the rule of the Comics Code. The other publisher who successfully stood up against the Comics Code Authority was Gilberton, the publisher of Classics Illustrated. So this, in my mind, places Helen Mayer in a really key historical position. Now, we all know that those Dell comics of the 40s and 50s and 60s were very conservative. They were, by and large, family-friendly, wholesome comics at all times. But as we get into the Silver Age, Dell becomes the only publisher who can license the Universal monsters, because the code won't allow the other publishers to have Frankenstein and Dracula and the Wolfman in their comics, right? You look at the code-approved Silver Age comics, the only time those characters appear in, say, a DC title is when they're being satirized in a Bob Hope or a Jerry Lewis comic. But in 1962, when the monster boom happened, I'm a monster kid, right? Dell was the only mainstream newsstand comic publisher who was in a position to start putting out comics featuring the Universal monster characters. And Gilberton with Classics Illustrated was the other. They reprinted and kept in print their adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein with a new painted cover by Norman Saunders, the man who painted the Mars Attacks cards that same year. So Helen Mayer was in a very unique, powerful position. And she's essentially forgotten today. If you go look on the internet, I have only ever found one drawing, a caricature of her likeness. I can't find any photos. She's like the lost mogul, if you will, of 20th century comics history. I don't know enough about how she functioned within the office. I don't know what power she did or did not wield, but Dell Comics outsold every other comic publisher until Mad came along.
It's true.
Yeah, and people forget that. And that also means Helen Mayer was the one overseeing Dell Comics and the partnership between Western and Dell when creators like Carl Barks and Walt Kelly were doing such incredible work in the comic books. And she must have been fairly progressive in that, we still don't quite understand how is it that Walt Kelly could create Pogo in a Dell comic and yet walk away with the property and do it as a comic strip, right?
Right.
There was some transition that happened there, and Helen Mayer was, one of the key executives that was overseeing Dell at that time. So I'd love to know more about Helen Mayer. There's very little out there about her. But I bring her up, again, because to my mind, knowing the history of American comics, Karen Berger is the next key executive who was a woman who built that kind of imprint and had that kind of I don't want to use the word power, you know. They just Karen cultivated a unique creative opportunity and environment. DC was willing to bankroll it. It was clearly successful enough that they indulged it, and it didn't end until Karen left DC and DC changed into whatever it is today, and they dissolved the Vertigo imprint. But that's a long lifespan in comics.
You give us some good stuff to investigate for future work here on the channel, man.
Yes.
I have two more pieces, two more
Yep.
questions about Swamp Thing. One, how deep into the series were you when you realized that you really had a viable hit sort of on your hands? Not from the quality aspect of you, like your own work. I'm sure you knew it was good from Anatomy Lesson forward. I'm talking about like audience response. And two, if you have a hit and you're having a grand old time making these comics and you know you're involved in the genre you want to be, what's the problem, man? What's the deal with
It's both. So, I was never cognizant of any point where it was a hit. Okay, I'll start there. And that's not me being humble. We weren't earning any royalties on the work. We were being paid the lowest page rate at DC, which we didn't find out until Julie Schwartz rang me up one day because Robert Loren Fleming and Keith Giffen wanted me to do a few pages in Ambush Bug. So, and I was friends with Keith and with Robert, and we got on the phone, and they said, what do you want to do? Like, Ambush Bug is a goof on everything at DC. And I said, I want to do the War of the Time Forgot, right? But I also want to do all the gorillas. Like, I want to goof on all that monster stuff. So I penciled like 4 pages of Ambush Bug. And the reason I'm talking about Ambush Bug is I turned in my pencils, and I filled out my pay voucher, and it was the pay vouchers I had in my desk that DC mailed me that I filled out every time on Swamp Thing. And I wrote in my page rate because I had presumed, you know, that was my rate. I didn't know what other people got at DC. And I attached the invoice right to the pages because it's like, oh, great, I got the work done. It was a lot of fun. I got it done quickly. It was a blast working with Bob and Keith. And I mail it in, and the phone rings, and I pick up, and it's Julie. And Julie Schwartz doesn't say hello or anything. He just says, Bissette, what is this clip to this page? And like, you know, I'm like, Julie? And he says, listen, I'm doing you a favor. Listen to this. And I hear him tearing paper. And I thought it was my pages. And he's like, I'm tearing up this invoice. What is this invoice? And I said, well, that's my rate at DC. And he says, wait a minute. And I could hear him close his door. He closes his office door and he comes back and he says, what do you mean this is your page rate? And I said, that's what I get on Swamp Thing. And I hear him go, oh. And he says, look, let Keith voucher for these pencil pages. You'll get Keith's rate. We were being paid a third of what was being paid on Ambush Bug.
man?
Okay. And I found out by getting paid very generously for 4 pages I did for Ambush Bug. And that was very sobering. It was like, holy shit, like we're really bottom of the pecking order up at DC. And we only found out later why that was. In a nutshell, DC had sold all rights to Melniker and Uslan when Melniker and Uslan bought film rights to Batman and Swamp Thing from DC Comics. DC held on to all kinds of aspects of Batman, but they sold Swamp Thing lock, stock, and barrel. And as it was explained to me by no less a person than Paul Levitz himself a couple of years later, because of circumstances I won't go into, Paul said it was the single worst deal DC had ever cut for licensing. They couldn't even do a poster, right? They could do nothing with Swamp Thing except a monthly comic book. And whatever work we did already belonged to the movie people. They could adapt anything they wanted from our comic, and we got nothing because DC got nothing. Okay? So going back to your original question, it didn't feel like a hit to us because we were earning poverty level wages. My first wife was working full time at a school for autistic children in Wilmington, Vermont, a place that no longer exists. Was called Green Meadows School. I was working, as hard as I could, and it was never hard enough and never fast enough on a monthly comic at DC, and we were still under the poverty level in the state we lived in. We were eligible for the WIC program. We got cheese and milk and dairy products every week for our kids to make sure our kids ate well. So it didn't feel like a hit to me. Now, on the other hand, I do remember a day when Rick Veitch said to me, I have never been this close to somebody who was becoming a celebrity. I think that's how Rick worded it. Or I've never been this close to somebody who was a hit. He may have used the word a hit, but I don't think that was it. Because to Rick and I, a hit meant what you took off a joint. I didn't feel that. I remember Rick saying it, and I remember laughing because it felt like a ludicrous thing to say because, we could barely afford groceries most weeks. And it wasn't because we were living high on the hog. We were in a little beat-up house, rental, had a car that was a piece of shit that we could barely keep on the road. So it never felt like a hit, I have earned far more off of Swamp Thing, and particularly John Constantine, since leaving DC than I ever did when I was doing the work for DC. That is a compliment to DC's royalty plan. Okay, I'm not putting it out there as sour grapes or bitter fruit. We still earn quarterly royalties from the work that we did. We don't get royalties off things like the Swamp Thing TV show. We do get royalties when, say, John Constantine appears in a video game, okay? Because we co-created John Constantine, but Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson co-created Swamp Thing. We didn't. So we don't get derivation royalties from Swamp Thing at all. We just get a reprint royalty when our actual work is reprinted. So it didn't feel like a hit. And to answer your second question, like why leave when there I am high on the hog in horror heaven, the relationship with DC got very problematic, not just over the deadline issues with me, but over another issue that I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement about, where DC was clearly in the wrong. I got a lawyer to defend me and my family, and DC settled. And it got difficult enough that there was one night when my first wife, Marlene, we were still married at the time, she heard me go in my studio, she heard me close the door, and then she said she got concerned after about 90 minutes because she didn't hear anything. She didn't hear me turn the music on, she didn't hear me working, and she opened the door to check on me, and she said I was sitting at the board, staring at the blank DC paper, and I don't get angry. My face was red, and veins were visible on my temple. I was just burning with rage at what was happening with DC. And she said, for your own health, you got to get out. You got to get away from this. In terms of my creative life, the reason I stepped away is I'm working on all these corporate-owned characters, right? And I had a dream one night where Jason Woodrue, the Floronic Man, came walking in the door. And I woke up from that dream and I went, I got to get out of this, right? Like if Jason Woodrue is walking into my dreams, owned by DC Time Warner, it's time for me to change courses. There were other little percolating factors. Alan and Len were very much into folding Swamp Thing into the DC universe. I was so against it that when we got the script that the Justice League appeared in, Alan and Len had been warned by John Totleben, Steve's not going to like this. And they played the game that Len, our editor, had said, no, you have to have Green Lantern and the Justice League in this issue. And it was actually Alan that wanted to do that. He confessed later. I fucking hate superheroes, guys. I'm not going to mince words. I hate drawing them. I understand I'm pretty good at it. I mean, the 1963 series, when Rick and I were doing it, it was fun doing the Fury and N-Man in particular. But I just do not believe in the superhero archetype in any way, shape, or form. It didn't work for me when I was 3 years old. It doesn't work for me at age 65. And it didn't work for me anywhere in between. And often, if you look back at the Swamp Things, if there is a sequence with superheroes, that means Rick Veitch came to my house and help me fill those pages, because I would call up Rick and go, "Fuck, there's 3 pages with green." And Rick would say, "All right, Bissette, I'll be over," you know. And the straw that broke the camel's back was the Crisis on Infinite Earths issue that we did. It was the worst issue of Swamp Thing we ever did. None of us were happy that we suddenly had to break the American Gothic continuity and do this one issue that was tied in with all this crazy shit that DC had schemed. And that was the point, I think, that I let Alan and John know I'm leaving within the year. I'm done. Because it wasn't a horror comic anymore. And we still did some good issues. You know, we did the werewolf issue after that, and we did the serial killer issue after that. But I had emotionally disconnected. I wasn't interested anymore. I felt like I had done everything I could possibly do in that particular venue and vehicle. And my heart was already set on, you know, we had gotten an invitation, we meaning John Tottleben, Alan Moore, and I, from Dave Sim, where Dave had said, "I will bankroll whatever you guys want to do. I will set it up so you can publish your own work." And Dave Sim, creator of Cerebus, was looking to open the eyes of the generation he saw himself as part of, those of us who are working with Marvel and DC. He wanted us to understand we could earn a better living and control our own creative paths without working under the umbrella of those corporate publishers. That was Dave's agenda. Unfortunately, Dave thought the 3 of us would go, "Hey, let's do Boogerman." And we would just take what we were doing on Swamp Thing and shift it over to our own book, which is probably what we should have done, but we didn't. And John Tottleben and I were like, we want to do a real horror comic. Like, I still love horror in all media, and I was frustrated with the fact there were no good horror comics, and I did not feel like the work we were doing in Swamp Thing was a horror comic anymore, right? It was a superhero comic that would go to dark places. I wanted to push the genre into the late 20th century. Every horror comic being done that did exist was still trying to imitate the old EC formula. And I'm thinking of Bruce Jones with Twisted Tales, right? Great artists. Some of the worst scripts Bruce Jones ever wrote. He did his best work at Warren with Creepy Era and Vampirillas. Some brilliant stories he did at Warren. And yet when he had his own horror comic, it's this regurgitation of the old EC formula. It's designed to look like an EC comic and read like an EC comic. And my creative path and my emotional path ended up distilling into Taboo. That's what I wanted to be doing. Was it a smart business move? No. I lost a fortune on Taboo, and I lost other people's fortunes on Taboo. Dave Sim bankrolled Taboo for the first 3 issues. With issue 4, Kevin Eastman had contacted me. We were friends. Kevin Eastman, Peter Laird, myself, Rick Veitch. We were all friends with the Mirage guys, Jim Lawson and Steve Murphy and all those guys. I miss them terribly. Kevin was like, "Hey, I'm going to start this new company, Tundra. Why don't you do Taboo here?" I lost a fortune for Kevin Eastman and Tundra.
I think everybody did.
Somebody made money there, but it wasn't, Kevin. And,
Steve, before we get to Tundra, how did you and Dave Sim come to know each other?
Through the Mid-Ohio Convention. There was a convention in Ohio called Mid-Ohio Con. It was an annual convention that was a fundraiser for the American Cancer Society. John Tottleben had been going for a number of years, and John said, "Hey, Steve, how about if I get the guys at Mid-Ohio to invite you over?" And Roger, I'm going to forget Roger's last name. There were 2 organizers, and Roger was the one that reached out to me, invited me out. They paid the way, and I went to Mid-Ohio Con. It was a little problematic because it was usually around Thanksgiving.
Right.
And, it's tough to leave your family on Thanksgiving weekend, especially every year. That got really old for my first wife. And but I went out, and Dave Sim was at Mid-Ohio. And Dave, he saw something with John and I. I don't know what. John taught me how to work conventions, right? John taught me everything about how to work conventions. I had never been to a comic convention until I was in Kubert School, and I think my first comic show was a Creation Con in New York City in, January of '77, probably. And the first artist I met there was Charlie Vess, and Charles is one of the great, great, great people in comics. I love Charlie and Karen Vess, and Roy Krenkel was sitting on my left, and Tom Yates knew Roy Krenkel, or wanted to know Roy Krenkel. I'm not sure which. So John, though, who wasn't in my original Kubert School class, John started in the fall of '77. He was in the class after ours. John taught me how to work conventions, how to do sketches, how to interact with fans, how to work the table. So whatever the John and Steve show was at that Mid-Ohio Con, Dave liked it. He looked at our chemistry. He looked at how we were working together and how we got along. And Dave, I think it was the second Mid-Ohio Con I ever did, took us aside and said, you guys don't understand. You're at the bottom of, you should be at the top of the pyramid, and you're at the bottom of the pyramid. You're carrying the pyramid. Dave had this whole theory about how the publishing business was set up, where the freelancers were the ones doing all the grunt work and the slave labor, and the money was being earned by the people at the top of the pyramid. And he's right. That is how business functions in America. And Dave met us the second day of that Mid-Ohio Con outside our hotel with a limousine. And he had the limo driver open the back seat. John and I didn't even know what you were supposed to do when someone opened the door to a limousine, right? And Dave's like, get in. And we get in the limo, and he had hired the limo to drive us to the convention. And he said, this is how you guys should be going to conventions, right? That the business is set up in such a way that you never get to do this. You're taking cabs or you're getting on the shuttle, whereas the editors and the assistant editors and the publishers, they're riding in limos. This is not right. This is not how it should be. Your guys' work is what's making money for these companies. And Dave, right then and there, started with the invitation. If you want to do something you own, I will help you publish it. And Dave didn't say, I will publish it. He said, I will help you publish it. And Dave's whole intention was to get us to seize the reins of our own lives and our own work and our own career. It all got polluted in later years because of I won't go into it all, but you'll know when I refer to Diamond Distribution attacking Puma Blues. You remember that?
Yes.
Okay, they had an argument with Dave Sim, and because Dave Sim was publishing Puma Blues, Diamond refused to carry Puma Blues all of a sudden. Dave realized that the ethical and business issues surrounding publishing other creators' work was going to constantly place anyone he published in a victimized position if he had a disagreement with the powers that be at Diamond or Capital or the distributors. So Dave funded Taboo. Right from the first issue, it was published by Spider Baby Graphics, which was Marlene O'Connor, my first wife's, and my company. It's a Vermont-based company. But Dave bankrolled it. And Dave said to me, okay, I'm not publishing people's work anymore, but I'm not going to leave you high and dry. I will keep Taboo going until you're done. And by the third issue, we were doing it ourselves, but we were losing so much money. And then Kevin Eastman offered to step in. So we met Dave at Mid-Ohio Con. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, because I was there, Dave made that same offer to Frank Miller, to Bill Sienkiewicz, anybody who was at the Mid-Ohio conventions, or anybody Dave crossed paths with who was doing innovative work in his mind's eye in the comic book field, Dave made that offer to, including Alan Moore. None of us understood the gift he was giving us. Well, even when we were doing it, we didn't understand the gift he was giving us.
Yeah, that's what I wondered about, Steve, because for our generation, and I'm talking about me and Ed, in our late 30s, early 40s, Image shows up and makes a lot of noise about creator rights. But as I get to know more about comics history, obviously this conversation goes back decades, but there's a big movement in the 80s, and I associate you, a lot of the people of Northampton, Scott McCloud, obviously Dave Sim, with the Creators' Bill of Rights and stuff. Is Dave Sim the guy that kind of plants that idea
Yeah.
and then it starts to sprout in a number of
Yeah,
cartoonists.
and Dave didn't just plant the idea. Dave bankrolled, he loved to call them summits. Dave loved to have the presidential suite at a hotel because it was presidential, right?
Letter from the president.
Part of it was ego, right? But part of it was also Dave was trying to live by his example that the head of a self-publishing company is the head of a company, and that he's on a par with the head of Time Warner, and he can stay in the presidential suite. And Dave could afford it. I mean, Cerebus was doing very well, and Dave and Gerhardt had a very streamlined, efficient operation up in Kitchener, Ontario. I used to go up once a year and visit them for 3 days to a week. And I got to see, ground zero, what the setup was and how it worked. And it was Dave, Sim, Gerhardt, who drew the book with him, and one person who manned the phones and did the office work. That's how it functioned during the time I knew Dave. And Dave extended that invitation to every creator he crossed paths with who he thought was doing valuable work and that he thought might be receptive to it. I knew Frank Miller well enough at that time that I did have a couple of conversations with Frank about the invite. Frank, in fact, at one point was doing a story for Taboo that he ultimately chose not to do. And he was afraid of taking the leap into self-publishing. And I got into trouble in my Comics Journal interview that you guys read before this conversation by pointing out some of the issues involving self-publishing. And one of them is, which pissed off a lot of writer friends of mine. And remember, I make part of my living writing as well as drawing. I'm not being, precious artist or anything. Writers need publishers in order to publish. Because if you're a writer and you want to make comics, unless you can draw, you got to work collaboratively. And it is so fraught with peril, that business relationship, that I would argue writers need publishers to be able to do their work. It's very rare to have a writer self-publisher like Harvey Pekar. But even then, Harvey's doing the work with his wife, Joyce Bravner. And I know I became friends with Joyce. I worked with her on 1 or 2 projects in the past. And Joyce was doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and I'm talking about well before Harvey got ill and was dealing with the illness that took him. It's also telling to me that a lot of the self-publishers who are artists and writers, the ones that flourish often flourish because they have a partner or they have a wife who helps them with the business end. Would Jeff Smith have ever finished Bone without Vijaya to oversee the business end of it? And Jeff is very transparent about talking about that. I'm not talking out of shop or betraying any confidences. If you watch the documentary, The Cartoonist, Jeff spells out exactly how he was, to use his own words, fucking up trying to self-publish because he just couldn't get in the board time and oversee a business and pack the orders and ship them out. He needed a partner. I have wrestled with publishing and self-publishing throughout my life since Dave Sim very generously put me on that path. And I would argue that Taboo was not self-published. Taboo, I was a co-publisher at best. And I would liken it to being a midwife, right? My son's going to hate it when I say this, but I'll tell you this story. Both my kids were home birth. And my son and I were both working at a video store in the late 90s, early 2000s. And one night we're both at the counter, and the midwife who had delivered both my son Danny and my daughter Maya came in the door. And I saw this great opportunity. Danny, this is so-and-so who delivered you. And they just looked at each other like, what do you say, right? Like I had just set up like the most awkward moment for people I love. And they had nothing to say to each other. And it's the same thing when you're a publisher. It's not your work. You didn't do it. You're the midwife. And so many publishers talk as if and act as if they publish something, it's theirs. But that's not the reality of it. They are midwives. And as an editor, you're even more of a midwife. And that also meant for me the steep learning curve of learning to let go, right? I worked on Taboo for 10 issues of over 100 pages each. And we did not sink our hooks legally or ethically into any of the work we published. Now, that drives people nuts today because I get requests often where people say, "Are you ever going to do a Taboo reprint?" I don't have any rights to reprint that work at all. It's not mine. I didn't set up any sort of agreement that allowed me to reprint it. And I look at myself as I was the midwife, you know. I'm happy that some of those babies went out there and did well. And the ones that only came out, saw print in Taboo and never were reprinted again, well, I did my best, you know. So, you know, that's to answer the Dave Sim question in a roundabout way.
Eventually, Jimmy and I are going to have to unpack the interview you gave in Comics Journal, because it brings about like a lot of interesting conversation that and thoughts that I never had about publishers. Like what are the ethics of a publisher and how they can handle things like, you know, if you publish the thing that births from hell, it seems reasonable that, you know, you get some participation or something. It's an interesting conversation to have.
It is, and it's an interesting conversation in part because most traditional publishing makes sure that it benefits from anything further that happens with a given, and I'll talk now in business terms, a given property that they published. My ethical orientation was it wasn't my work, it didn't belong to me, and I'll tell you the biggest headache with From Hell was once it was going to be adapted into a film, I cannot tell you how much legal paperwork I had to sign time and time again. And it was legal paperwork that stated and restated I had no business interest in the property, right? And Alan doesn't know about that, and Eddie doesn't know about it unless I mentioned it in the Comics Journal interview. I haven't mentioned it since, but you know, divesting yourself of that kind of proprietary interest that most publishers lock themselves into is just as problematic as if it would have been if I had locked myself into it. And it sucks when at the end of the day, say you lose a friend over those kind of issues because you're trying to do right by them, but c'est la vie, that's life.
That's one of the most troubling parts, you know, the business apparatus around making art. It's such a difficult thing to navigate.
How we all project things, because, you know, we all have, I use the metaphor of the tapes, you know, we all have certain child-parent relationship things that we're completely unconscious of, and we play them out with our editors and publishers all the time. It's just, it's human nature, you know, it's the primal gray stuff that drives us. And it's hard. And a lot of publishers really put their asses on the line. You know, I think of a publisher like Annie Koyama, who's been publishing some really innovative work that might not have seen print before. And I understand when, you know, Gary Groth and I probably get together about once every 10 years, one way or another. And, you know, there's an adversarial relationship there in many ways, in part because I always saw a conflict of interest between Fantagraphics as a publisher and Fantagraphics presenting itself as a journalistic entity. How can you report on an industry you're part of without being prejudicial?
And I don't think you were alone in that. That was a common criticism I would see leveled at Fantagraphics, Gary Groth, and Comics Journal.
At the same time, though, as a reader, thank fucking God for Fantagraphics, you know? And,
right.
And I chose that word very carefully when I referred to the generation that we're seeing and that we're working with at the Center for Cartoon Studies being the Fantagraphics generation, because they still see, a lot of the graduates still see getting a contract with Fantagraphics as kind of a rite of passage. There's that hard learning curve of, oh my God, there's not much money here. Well, welcome to independent publishing, right? I mean, Fantagraphics is not a fat publisher in terms of revenue streams, but there's still the imprimatur of Fantagraphics carries a lot of cultural weight, and it is still a very desirable publisher to work with for a lot of young independent cartoonists. It's a hard lesson when they do the work, the book comes out, they don't earn anything for it, and it drops out of print. It's like, oh shit, you know. On the other hand, you know, Fantagraphics has maintained a working relationship with Jaime and Gilbert Hernandez for how long, you know? And it's phenomenal. the good work that's come out of there. But there's a lot of ethical issues attached to it, and I have wrestled with a lot of that stuff first person during my own times of publishing or co-publishing, or choosing not to publish. I still have people send me really good work because they get their hands on an issue of Taboo and they think that I'm a publisher, and I always decline. And it's hard. The impetus is still there to this work should be out there in the world. But the only role that I can ethically play in helping get that work out in the world right now is as a teacher. That's the best I can do.
It's awesome though, but we're at this point where Taboo is at Tundra. So Tundra, obviously one of the very legendary entities in the history of comics and self-publishing and small publishing. What do you want to tell us about Tundra and your experience there with Taboo and being around the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? That was a really interesting part of the Comics Journal interview, the way you described the effect of success on those guys, specifically Eastman and Laird. Basically, the success meant they don't get to draw the Turtles anymore because they're so busy with business, which maybe leads to Eastman finding Tundra.
Well, I'll answer that in two ways. I'll say right from the start, the book has not been written that needs to exist about, what happened with Mirage Studios and the Turtles. I know there's been a couple of fluff books out there, offering some sort of overview of the Turtle dynasty or whatever, but it is an amazing story, and I'm not going to tell it here. And I may not be the one to tell parts of the story because I was an observer. I did get to work on some of the issues. It was the kind of working relationship where if the guys needed a hand with Do-A-Shade, working on an issue of Leonardo special or something, I might drive down and put in an afternoon. Or sometimes you'd drive down just to visit and have lunch, and then they'd say, "Hey, you want to help us with what we're doing up here?" It was very informal. It was a lot of fun in the early days. But you're asking me about Tundra, and I'll bring people's attention to two entities. Kevin and Peter, and the way Kevin put it was, comics gave them their life and their lifestyle. They wanted to give back. That was Kevin's paraphrase. I'm paraphrasing things Kevin said. Kevin and Peter had very different personalities, and it was one of their strengths as a team. Kevin was impulsive, wanted to get things done. He was the younger of the two, had a lot of energy, very charismatic. And Peter was more of a devil's advocate. He'd seen a lot of the world. He was older. He'd been through hard times. He was enjoying good times. But Peter's disposition was he would look at a problem from all points of view. And it would get frustrating for them as a team sometimes. We could see friction where Kevin wanted to move on something quickly, and Peter wanted to think about it, And the way that manifests in the 1990s comic scene is Kevin founded Tundra, and he was going to become this new aggressive, progressive publishing force of creator-owned comics, and they were going to enshrine the Creator Bill of Rights as this is the law of the land at Tundra Publishing. And they quickly found out that it's hard to run a publishing company driven by the Creator Bill of Rights, right? Because if all the balls are in the creator's basket, then what's left for the publisher to carry on? And Kevin came in as probably one of the best financed, bankrolled, independent publishers in the history of comics at that time. And we've since seen other permutations of this, right? What was the outfit that was down in Florida?
CrossGen.
Yeah, CrossGen. Right. So we've seen other incarnations of this impetus, right? But Kevin really wanted to do it right. His heart was in the right place. The goals were that he articulated to Rick Veitch and I in a couple of one-on-one meetings, and he wanted Rick and I involved, right? He looked up to us in terms of the work we'd done in comics and so on, and he liked and respected us. Peter, on the other hand, looked at this problem, right? And the problem being, how do I give back to the comics industry that I love and that's feeding me so well now? And Peter came up with the Xeric Foundation. So Kevin, with Tundra, sets up a business where he's got an office, he's going to run it, and he brings in his uncle to run it, his uncle who has no experience with publishing or comics. But he feels a debt to his uncle because his uncle, Quentin, is the one who ponied up the check that allowed them to print the original print run of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Peter looks at what's happening at Tundra, and Xeric Foundation is the eloquent solution to all the problems that Kevin Eastman found himself mired in at Tundra. And these were problems that compounded daily, okay? It was just an incredible obstacle course. I have nothing but sympathy for Kevin in terms of what he was trying to do, but it really turned into a clusterfuck very quickly. And not because of malice, and not because the goals were off base or anything, but, you know, it was too big, too fast to work. Peter looked at that and went, I don't want to have hands-on, right? And if it's going to be creator-owned work, I don't want to set up an entity in which all the temptations that are presented to a publisher have to be dealt with. So Peter takes a lump of money, and I have no idea what that amount was, but let's say for the purpose of this conversation that Kevin and Peter put up equal initial bankrolls. You know, Kevin puts up X amount, let's say $2 million to start Tundra. Peter puts up $2 million to start the Xeric. The Xeric Foundation is set up where the interest from that lump of money that Peter set up drives a series of grants that will be given to professions and fields and industries that Peter has a vested or personal interest in. And one of them happens to be comics. And Peter sets it up so there's a committee that is going to meet and look at submissions made in a grant application process to Xeric. And the committee, which does not involve Peter Laird, is going to decide which work merits the support of a Xeric grant. Peter also understands the dynamic of artists and freelancers and creative people well enough to go, I don't want to be involved in their lives, right?
Smart.
Creators are fucking crazy people, right? And most creators are terrible business people, right? It's rare to have a Will Eisner or a Colleen Durand who understand the business and the art and what they need to do, you know, to make it all work. And Peter sets it up so that the Xeric Foundation is going to give a grant that's going to pay for the printing bill on that creator's work that they've submitted. So Peter accomplishes, I believe, something quite comparable to what Tundra was trying to accomplish. Peter sustained it for longer. I still regret that the Xeric Foundation, which I believe still exists, no longer bankrolls comics. My understanding, and this is hearsay from me, my understanding is that once crowdfunding took off, Kickstarter and so on and so forth, Peter decided comics didn't need that anymore. But I have to tell you, at the Center for Cartoon Studies, we had students who applied for the Xeric Foundation every year. And those students who landed a Xeric Foundation grant, it did give them a prestigious leg up into the industry they were entering because the comics industry recognized the Xeric grant as being a meaningful badge of honor. And that gave them something to build on that isn't associated with crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is just, who knows, right?
Yeah, I can say as a comics fan, I would seek out Xeric titles. You know, you would get the announcement every 6 months of who received a Xeric grant, and I would look for those books. You know, it definitely meant something.
I still have a lot of that work in my collection because it gave you at least some indication, oh, this work must be of interest because it was worthy of a Xeric grant. And I could see the effect it had the year they stopped doing it, that suddenly there was one less path that a CCS student or graduate could strive for.
There's also, we don't always say it enough, but the process of applying for a grant like that tremendously beneficial just putting together that application.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And I believe the Zurich grant was based on you have to show either a complete work or a work near enough to completion that it was reasonably going to go to a printer within, a finite period of time. So that meant that the person applying for that grant, they not only were going through the process of applying for the grant and all that entails, but they had already done so much work on a project they were committed to that it was ready or just about ready to go to print. Also, by setting up the Zurich Foundation, Peter was not setting up an entity that served any editorial function, right? There was no identity associated with the Zurich Foundation. And as you just said, we would hear about a Zurich Foundation winner and we go look for it, but we weren't looking for that kind of, like you think of Vertigo and you think of a certain personality to the work that appeared in Vertigo. The Zurich didn't have that. It didn't have that baggage, and it didn't have any kind of an editorial imperative. It literally came across as a banner of quality. This was good enough to see print, right? So I look at those two, and that's how I'd like to frame any conversation about Tundra and what happened with Tundra is I don't want to get into the personalities or how much money was lost or what the power games were or what good work came out or good work didn't come out. To me, it really comes down to both Kevin and Peter had the means to bankroll something that would benefit other creators. Kevin chose the traditional path of I will launch a publishing entity, and we all saw what happened one way or another. Peter looked at the same problem and went, we don't need another publisher. The publisher's the problem. And in fact, I would argue that if anybody knew that, it should have been Kevin and Peter, right? I mean, they reaped the whirlwind of benefits of doing independently creator-owned work. They had success beyond the wildest imaginings of anybody I had ever known in the comic book field before that time. And I think Peter made the saner choice. He looked at it and went, no, we don't need another publisher. We need a means of independent creators getting their first toe out there and give them the lift that's so hard to get when you're a creator trying to get your first significant work out into the world.
I think it's the benefits of, it's age and wisdom. Eastman was like 27 years old or something like that whenever he put Tundra together, and Peter Laird was proper married man, 10 years older or 11 years older, something like that. So,
although there's plenty of people that have been in Peter's age group, preferred wisdom group, that have made even bigger mistakes than Kevin Eastman will ever. So,
sure,
myself perhaps included. So, I think it really came down to understanding it as control versus not wanting control. And I won't say Kevin was selfish in his motive, but I can say I believe Peter was completely unselfish in his motives.
Right.
And Peter set up something that was uncluttered by all the problems that ultimately plagued, crippled, and ultimately took down not just Tundra, but also Kitchen Sink. I mean, it's tragic how that all went.
How many issues of Taboo came out with the help of Tundra, of Eastman?
Well, there are 10 issues of Taboo in all. Taboo 1 through 9 and Taboo Especial. I did Taboo 1 and 2 with my first wife, Marlene O'Connor, with the bankrolling that Dave Sim provided. Taboo 3 was essentially the only issue that we bankrolled ourselves. We tried to bankroll Taboo 4, and we stumbled into a clusterfuck, twice in the same interview, in which I decided I'm a Vermont creator. I'm born and raised in this state. I'm going to work with a Vermont printer. Stupidest decision I ever made in my life. Right?
Read about that in the Eastman interview too, with his own endeavors.
That's it. I found a sympathetic and very professional printer, and then we hit speed bump after speed bump. The printer was right on board with what we were doing, but I couldn't find production facilities that would, I couldn't even find local photographers that would photograph original art to do the transparencies, right? They would take offense at the artwork. Okay. We had one production house that it wasn't the artwork we were doing that pissed them off. They happened to see the cover spread of the printed outside and inside cover, and because it had the Alan Moore from Hell drawing that had the pentagram over the map of London, they decided we were Satanists, and they weren't going to do any work with Satanists.
Wow.
And then the printer prints the interior of the book, and the binder refuses to bind the book. So we then had to take the interior pages printed in Bellows Falls, Vermont, ship them by pallet loads down to the only binder in the Boston area who had agreed to bind the book. And this is why Taboo #2 has a binding like a tablet. Because the pages are supposed to go into the bindery right off the press. We had to have all the pages prepared and set up as signatures, and they were shipped. And a week to 2 weeks later, they finally were bound. And by then, the glue doesn't adhere on the way that it does, in a proper binding process. And it ended up losing us about $10,000 before we were done. All because of prudishness and people who objected to the content. So Tundra came on board and rescued us with Taboo #4. And we did Taboo 4, 5, 6, and a special at Tundra. So it was 1 year's worth of Taboo. And I know Eddie Campbell then and now loves to jive that, Taboo was supposed to be a quarterly and they would come out annually. By and large, Eddie's right. But the 1 year, we didn't have to fight with printers or money or how we were going to get work done. We did get 4 issues out, and Taboo Special only exists as a special because there was no chapter from Hell ready for an issue of Taboo. So that's how it went. And then the final 2 issues, which were Taboo 8 and 9, were published with Kitchen Sink. And those 2 issues, my name is not on them as editor, even though I was co-editor on them. Phil Amara was working with Dennis Kitchen at that time, and Phil was getting ready to make the leap to Dark Horse Comics, and having the editor credit would serve Phil very well. He did work with me on those 2 books. I'm not saying Phil didn't do the work, but I chose to leave my name off so that Phil would have the benefit of having edited those 2 volumes of Taboo. Those are also the 2 issues that taught me I could not work with a publisher. Because when I brought in all the material we had, there were certain stories Dennis Kitchen just didn't want to publish. And he said, Steve, I'm not censoring you, but if I'm going to do these issues, it has to be content I'm comfortable with. And I went, that's fine. The creators were paid for their work, and the originals were returned. But that's also the point where I went, okay, Taboo's over. You can't have a publication named Taboo if you have a publishing entity that's going to micromanage what's allowed and not allowed in a publication called Taboo. So
it's such an interesting anthology. Like comics history has these high points of various anthologies that are important or beautiful. Raw comes to mind from the early 80s. And I feel like Taboo is one of those standout anthologies that in some ways, maybe because it's horror, it's not as celebrated as I feel like it should be. Obviously great work has come out of it, like From Hell is, one of the standouts, but it's an exceptional anthology historically, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, my models were twofold. One of my models was definitely Raw. In fact, I reached out to Art Spiegelman and Francois Millet early on, not to get their blessing or direct help, but to see if they would help put me in touch with Charles Burns and a couple of other creators whose work had appeared in Raw. My other model was Dangerous Visions, the Harlan Ellison anthology, Dangerous Visions and Dangerous Visions again. And those were a model because I had grown up reading science fiction, and Harlan Ellison's Dangerous Visions was the kind of anthology that was a game changer, altered what was possible in science fiction. And I saw that as being necessary to pull a genre of comics I loved out of that shadow of EC Comics I talked about earlier and into the late 20th century. I was reading as many comics as I could get my hands on, and all the great horror comics that were coming out, weren't appearing in horror comics. You know, they were appearing in Metal Hurlant. They were appearing in Raw. They were appearing in these one-shot anthologies like Bad Times. The three of us could list a number of those anthologies that were sort of like percolating out there and would get one or two issues out. There'd be great individual works in there, but they were hard to find. And John Tolliver and I felt, okay, somebody has to put all this under one cover and say, this is horror comics, right? And that was what Taboo was. And the other thing that Taboo was I wanted creators to only do work that was disturbing to them, right? Alan Moore talked at the time about the analogy of Harvey Kurtzman does Mad Comics in the early 50s when it was a comic book. And Mad's a big hit. So every publisher starts putting out comics that look like Mad, but none of them are funny. None of them have any teeth because they're just trying to emulate the formula that they recognize in Mad as being something they can imitate. That's what I felt horror comics had become by the 1980s, and in fact had been for many decades. To my mind, the last great eruption of amazing horror comics in North American comics history were in the underground comics. Skull, Boogeyman, Slow Death, one-shots like Up from the Deep, Richard Corbin and Jack Jackson. And that's what I and John Tolliver, that's what we were thinking of with Taboo. We need to do what the underground horror comics did without imitating the underground horror comics. And the way to do that was to put out an invitation to creators, but make it very clear, we only want work that disturbs you. If it doesn't disturb you, don't bother mailing it to us. And we got submissions from big names in comics, right? Instantly. And they would send us these horrible scripts or these stupid stories that could have been published in Web of Horror or anything else. And I'm not being pejorative to Web of Horror. I love Web of Horror. I still have them. But that was an imitation of what Creepy, Eerie, and Vampirilla were doing, right? We wanted people to really dig deep, and that's what Taboo was. Also, the other thing Taboo was I felt like nobody understood in comics. Plenty of people understood in the real world, in the literature of the genre and so on, that horror isn't just one thing. Horror embraces wonder and awe and many, many things other than fear. And horror is a powerful genre. And in that, I really wanted to shepherd collections of new comics work that plucked deeper nerves than anybody was plucking in what were being accepted and sold as horror comics. And I felt by Taboo 2 and especially by Taboo 4, we were getting there. There's work in there I don't believe any other publisher would have touched.
Yeah, there's a real visionary quality to it. And I've become in the last several years, when I think of what makes for good comics, having a vision, and it should go without saying, I guess, but it becomes more and more important to me in cartoonists. Like, I think it's more important to the success of a cartoonist is having that vision, really believing in this thing, almost on a conceptual level, and then, manifesting it, however that happens. But that visionary quality is there in Taboo, and I think historically that's a lot of the work I look at has that quality.
Yeah, and sometimes that quality is, one of the things that was funny about Taboo is the deeper we got into it, the more we realized that non-genre work was the most powerful work being done in the genre. I'll give you an example. I had a lot of people that would scratch their heads, like, why are you putting Rick Grimes in here every issue? And Rick Grimes's work, to me, fit Taboo because they were like transmissions from the planet Pluto or something. It's like,
right.
I don't think like that. I don't draw like that. But it was so vivid and it was so concrete and it was so of its own essence that it had to be part of Taboo, right? And I felt the same way about Rick Grimes's work as I did an artist that most people would associate with horror comics, like S. Clay Wilson. But by 1988, when we put out Taboo 1, no publishers were touching S. Clay Wilson's work. They were all afraid of it, And to John Tolliver and I, it was like, we got to get S. Clay. Like, that was one of the first names that came out of our mouth. Like, we love S. Clay Wilson. We understand why publishers are afraid of him, and that's why we have to publish him. And with S. Clay, as with Rick Grimes, it was like, whatever you want to do, right? Because whatever came out of their pens and their minds was going to be disturbing. That was just how they're wired as creators. And when you talk about a word like visionary connected with comic book creator, I think that applies to someone like S. Clay Wilson, Rick Grimes, to just cherry pick two names, not out of favoritism, but just those were creators where I don't think I refused anything they sent in, because everything they sent in blew me away and was unlike anything I'd ever read or seen before, including their own work.
Should we go to 1963?
I really want to. Steve, can you handle that?
Is that our next stop?
Baby.
Oh, you're the man, dude. Can you compare and contrast Image as a publisher and Eastman's work as a publisher?
I can. And I'll tell you why. Apples and oranges is the wrong metaphor. It's like a moose and the moon. Okay. And I can't talk about Image as a publisher because my experience with Image was not as a publisher. It was Jim Valentino as a publisher. Jim Valentino was the one that reached out to me first through Larry Marder. A number of us had become quite close friends, we thought, and we were close friends at that time with Larry Marder, creator of Bean World. Larry is best known in comics for writing and drawing Bean World, but in the comics industry at that time, and we're talking about 1991, 92 here, Larry's bread and butter was as an advertising man, right? Larry was rooted in hardcore Chicago advertising, so think Mad Men rather than Eclipse Comics. Larry doing Bean World was his like moonlighting from the bread and butter he earned working in advertising. And one of his clients that he invited us in different levels in to work with was a comic book chain run by Gary Calabuono out of the Chicago area. And the ads for Gary's line of comic shop is one of the few genuine ads that appear in the 1963 comics. And it really comes down to this in a nutshell. Jim Valentino didn't want me, and he didn't want Rick Veitch. And I'm not being cantankerous about saying that or whatever, and I don't mean any ill will at all toward Jim. He was wonderful to work with. Image wanted Alan Moore, and they didn't know how to reach Alan Moore. They knew I had worked with Alan Moore, and they knew that I not only had worked with Alan Moore at DC Comics on Swamp Thing, but they also knew from Taboo that I was working with Alan Moore on a different business level in terms of From Hell and Lost Girls both debuting and being serialized initially in Taboo. So I got a call from Larry Marder saying, Steve, Jim Valentino would like to talk to you about doing a project. And Larry would first talk to you as the company man he was representing, but we were friends. So Larry would then say, okay, I'm putting a different hat on now. And he would say, and he said in this case, what they really want is to work with you and Alan Moore. And I knew what that meant. You know, Alan was the big fish. I'm not even a fish. I'm the crayfish. But that's fine. So I knew some things that Larry Marder and Jim Valentino at that time didn't know. And one of them was that all of us, Alan, Rick Veitch, myself, were sort of reeling from the implosion that was happening with Tundra. And for Alan Moore, it was compounded further by the implosion of Big Numbers, which was a project that Alan really believed in and had even put his own money into by launching Mad Love as a publishing imprint. Some of that was subsidized by Dave Sim, but a lot of it was the money Alan had been earning from Watchmen and all the, you know, amazing work he had done for other comic publishers. And he lost a fortune on Big Numbers. And I won't go into that whole story. So what I knew when Larry called was we all needed a project to work on to get ourselves back up on our feet. Taboo was imploding because Tundra was imploding. I pulled the plug on Taboo before Tundra collapsed because I read the tea leaves and could see this is doomed. I also pulled the plug on Taboo, not to divert from your question about 63, but I got a call from Karen Berger saying, Steve, we're going to do something just like Taboo, but on a bigger scale. And that's what Vertigo became. And the reason Karen was calling me is she wanted to get the contact information for some of the creators that had appeared in Taboo. The same phone call, by the way, I had made to Art Spiegelman and Francois Millet back in 1986. So I felt like, okay, if DC and Karen are going to be doing a line of comics that are going to pick up the baton and run with it, Taboo has served its purpose. I'm done with it, right? What I really wanted to do was this crazy dinosaur comic. And I didn't have the means to do it. I didn't have the money. We were really in the hole from all the Taboo years. And so I called up Al. First I called Rick Veitch before I called Alan. I said, Rick, I just got this phone call from Larry Marder. Are you interested in having anything to do with this? And Rick was like, if you can put it together, Steve, and if it looks like it's going to work, let's do it. And then I called Alan. And there were a number of factors. I won't go into too much detail, but Alan was overworked at this time. Fans and readers have these fantasies about the people that make the comics and write the books and make the movies and TV shows that we love. We all think they're rich and successful. They're not in a lot of cases. And Alan was in this horrible vice where he was committed to fulfilling and completing these major works from Hell, Lost Girls, his first novel, The Voice of Fire, and yet none of them were bringing in sufficient income because they were all works that he owned or co-owned in the case of Lost Girls and From Hell. And he was stretched horribly thin and had a number of family members he was taking care of at the time. We also had a situation where Rick and I were seeing that Tundra was going under and we would need to do something. So knowing Alan's situation, he's overworked, he needs income. When I called him to talk to him about he and Rick and I doing something together, Alan said, I just can't take on one more thing. And I said, what if we do it Marvel style? What if you've worked with Rick and I for years now. What if you just come up with characters and storylines? We pencil them, we fax them to you, you dialogue them. That way you don't have to sit down at a typewriter at any point in time that you don't want to, right? You can call us on the phone, brainstorm the way we love to anyway. We were all adept at that and had done it together as a threesome even. Let's just do it that way. And that sounded enticing to Alan. He thought that was viable, and he knew that Rick and I would do the hard work of, the penciling and so on. He knew our work. He knew we could do it. And so we put together the deal that was 1963 after a series of conversations with Jim Valentino, where Jim Valentino said, right, here's the Image deal. And remember, this is when Image was only a year old. You guys do the work. There's no money up front. But you get 80% of the back end. Whatever the book earns, you guys get 80%. And you tell us how you want it split up between you. Well, that almost worked. Rick and I were pragmatic enough that we knew, well, we got to get some kind of a page rate, even if it's a nominal page rate. So what I did is I was a shareholder in a video superstore in Brattleboro, Vermont that was called First Run Video. It was the first video superstore in southern Vermont. And superstore means a certain amount of floor space in the retail world. And I was a shareholder in that business from its inception. And I was friends with the proprietor of First Run Video, and he had been wanting me to get more involved with the business. And I said, well, how about if I become your promotional manager and I come into the office on Fridays and I get a weekly paycheck for that day? And it wasn't much of a paycheck, but it meant there was always going to be a paycheck every week. And then we negotiated with Jim Valentino a nominal page rate, so that a little bit of money, and I'm talking about like $50 a page, not much more than that, would be paid for every pencil page and finished script page. So there was a little bit of money coming in for Alan, a little bit of money justifying Rick Veitch and I getting together. And Rick went the extra mile. Rick said, okay, Bissette, I know your shitty work habits. He had a friend who had a cabin, a 2-room cabin, that was geographically almost exactly between where I lived and where Rick lived. And we would meet there 5 days a week and pencil. That would be our work studio. And that's how we got the project done. Alan would phone us up and, we would brainstorm stories, or Alan would call up with a complete story. We would use fax machines between us. There was no internet at this time, to design the characters and so on. And it was a pretty free-form process. And out of that, I ended up doing 3 stories, 3 characters, the Fury, Endman, and the Hypernaut. And Rick ended up doing much more than that, because he was better with deadlines, quicker on the draw. And at a certain point in time, the Fury was supposed to be the first issue, but Alan decided Mystery Incorporated should be first and called me up and said, is it okay if Mystery Incorporated goes first? Now, bear in mind, I'll put my business hat on. I knew the minute I said yes, I was losing money, right? Because issue number 1s always sell better.
Sure.
But I didn't care. Rick and Alan were partners, and if that's how it had to go, that's the way it was going to go. And we also reached out to other people we had either worked with or wanted to work with. So we invited Dave Gibbons in, John Toddleben, Don Simpson, and I reached out to Chester Brown because I love Chester's work, and I had met Chester at a couple of events up in Canada. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to pencil something Chester Brown inked? And Chester was up for it. And Chester and I aren't buddies or friends or anything, but we had met and always had a good time or got along on panels. Sometimes butting heads, I have a fond memory of a panel in Toronto with Gary Groth, Bill Sienkiewicz, Chester Brown, and myself about violence and censorship in comics. And, Gary had this sort of highfalutin speech at the beginning, and I said, well, in Taboo, I only publish work if I feel like it really has some sort of emotional heft or societal, weight to it, blah, blah, blah. And Chester giggled and said, I like violence in comics. I like bloody comics. If I feel like drawing something bloody, I'm going to draw it. I don't need to justify it to anybody. And that's when I fell in love with Chester. So we ended up doing 63, and it didn't, the way it turned out, we ended up with 6 issues that were just what we were picturing. But at a certain point in time, there was a reliance on a second image partner, Jim Lee, and Jim Lee had seized control of the annual. It was supposed to be 6 issues, concluding with a giant annual in the form of the old Silver Age Batman, Superman, Jimmy Olsen, Lois Lane annuals. And Jim Lee seized control of that with Rick's and my and Alan's permission early on. It was this whole crazy scene at the San Diego Con in 1992. And we didn't realize till after the fact that it had nothing to do with us. It just had to do with the pissing contests that were going on between the individual players at Image, Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, Jim Valentino. And my perception, I'm not saying this is what happened, but my perception is Jim Lee wanted to show up Jim Valentino at the announcement at that San Diego Con. Because when Jim Valentino got up and announced that he was working on a brand new project with Alan Moore and Rick Veitch and Steve Bissette, and Rick and Steve are in the audience, and this Image crowd goes nuts, and Jim Lee grabbed the microphone and said, and I'm doing the annual, after this bizarre day of phone calls to Alan and Rick and I on the floor of the convention, and Alan in England as Jim Lee's jockeying to take over the annual, and then he didn't do anything. He never did a single thing, and in fact, he declared he was taking a sabbatical right at the time we needed him. And the whole thing kind of fell apart at the end. And in a nutshell, that's what happened. That's my perception of what happened anyway. I was the first of the partners as this was falling apart. It was getting harder and harder to get Alan on the phone. He was having his own trials and tribulations in England that I was not aware of at the time because no one said anything to me about it, including Alan. And we couldn't get Jim Lee to respond to anything. I still have the one fax he sent us with this beautiful drawing of one of the characters from Mystery Incorporated, and then nothing. We could not get him or anyone in his studio on the phone. And I contacted Rick and Alan, and I said, look, I'll pencil my part of the annual, but I can't edit or co-edit a project where I can't get the two principal players, Jim Lee and Alan Moore, to talk. Alan actually scripted the beginning of the annual. There were a number of pages scripted, not a majority of pages, but there were, 10 or 15 pages of script that we did have. We just couldn't get anyone to move. The best analogy I can give you is what Larry Marder said to me at the time, because I was heartbroken at it. And Rick took it really hard, and I can't blame him. He felt like I was, bailing out of the project. And Larry Marder called up and said, Steve, you know what? You and Rick are the tugboats. You're trying to pull these cruisers, these cruise ships into the harbor. And what can you do? And there was nothing we could do or I could do. And that's why there was no annual. That's why we never completed it, unfortunately.
Yeah, one of the great uncompleted series in the history of comics.
Another interesting work, though. I remember, reading that at the time. I was reading Image books and whatever I could get my hands on, and I just remember that book being so different than everything I looked at. And it was a piece, like, historically for me, where it's like, oh, you're aware of production now. Right. What is this coloring process that's different than everything else? I think it's another book that was important to a lot of aspiring creators and a lot of people that are looking at these comics and trying to understand them and make their own and imagine what they can make. That was a strange, amazing book, especially for being an Image book. It was just so different than everything I saw at that moment.
Yeah, Image didn't know what to make of it.
Sure.
Image is a publisher. You were asking, the whole beginning of this conversation was you wanted me to compare publishers. Image is a publisher. They didn't know what to make of what we were doing. When I think of the entity that was Image at that time, Jim Valentino got it. Jim understood. Remember, Jim had done Normal Man.
Right.
Normal Man?
Yep.
Okay. Do you want to explain it to your listeners?
Well, he came out of the black and white indie comics, and Normal Man was a normal man in a superhero world, but filtered through that black and white explosion style of comics. He was an indie guy.
It was an indie guy, and Normal Man was the ultimate crossover comic at the time. Like, Jim did his own version of all the characters from all the comics that he loved, and they all featured it. Normal Man was the one guy who could cross all the parallel universes. So Jim Valentino totally understood what we were doing with 1963. He got it. And it was in his wheelhouse. And it was in his, realm of the comics he'd grown up with. The other Image guys didn't get it. Like, it's on newsprint. Why are they using this shitty coloring process, right? Whereas we had spared no expense in tracking down and working with Murphy Anderson and his son, Murphy Anderson Jr. They did all the production on the color and the color sets. And part of why we worked with Murphy and Murphy is the older Murphy Anderson had drawn those Silver Age DC comics like Hawkman and the Spectre and so on. And the older Murphy would tell us when we turned in Anthony Toland's color guides, or we had a couple of different people who did color guides. Murphy could tell us, yeah, they had that color, or no, they wouldn't have used that color, they would have used this color, right? So, it was spot on, as close as we could get in 1993 to what a Silver Age comic from 1963 actually looked and felt like. And the only guys at Image that got it were, as far as we could tell, were Jim Valentino and Larry Marder. And when the sales figures came in for the first book, Mystery Incorporated, for us, it was the most comics we had ever sold in our lives, guys. Like, it was amazing. It was like 500,000 copies of Mystery Incorporated #1. And to the Image guys, that's peanuts. To Todd and Jim and Rob Liefeld, they were just like, they were looking for $1 million to $2 million, So we were like shit on their shoe. There was never an ad for the 1963 line. I remember brainstorming on the phone. Larry Marder was trying to work up an ad campaign, and we came up with the idea of photos, instead of using the covers, having photos of kids with our comic book rolled up in their back pocket riding a Schwinn bicycle from 1963. And Larry had come up with this great plan for it, and it all got deep six because the Image guys just, why throw good money after bad? Like, these just aren't selling enough. And every issue, we watched it with the sales. Every single issue lost 100,000 in sales.
We we interviewed Dave Gibbons month and a half, 2 months ago, and the only thing he said about 1963, and I quote, is $1 million comic books. He said, man, like when he was talking about getting his color, his computer apparatus up and running for Martha Washington and stuff. So even if it was losing unit numbers of sales, still must have been bringing in some good loot, and I'm sure
it was the most I ever earned in my life, all my life combined. Okay,
incredible.
And being able, and we shared equal partners with everybody that was part of the book. So, you know, being able to cut a check to Chester Brown that was more than he'd ever seen for his inking the Hypernaut story was very gratifying. But then we started hitting speed bumps. Like, Rick and I were doing all the editing, but we weren't paying ourselves for editors. Like, we didn't take a share as editors. We just earned the same as everybody else based on how many pages we had done in that issue. And this wasn't greed kicking in. This became problematic when we weren't paying ourselves for the pinups in the issues that we'd drawn, but somebody who had drawn a pinup was expecting that fat check. And so things did get fraught on that end of things, but everybody earned very, very well off of that. Yeah, it was amazing. And it was amazing to be someone who had worked in comics by that time for over 15 years, and we're seeing this kind of payday, but we're hearing on the phone, it's not enough.
It's incredible.
And the other problem, which I'll state in just 2 sentences, was as follows. Image didn't want us or 1963. Image wanted Alan Moore. And what happened was, as soon as Jim Valentino got the 1963 project up and going, all the other partners called Alan and pulled him in to work on their books. So we lost Alan's time and energy as that got poured into Spawn books with Todd and, you know, Supreme with Rob and what have you. And it was kind of eerie because it was a variation on what I had seen happen at Tundra when the powers that be at Tundra looked at Taboo and went, oh, you know, people like Taboo, but they love From Hell. How about if we print From Hell as its own book? And what they were doing was killing Taboo, right? You take the Prime serial out of Taboo and you're killing the anthology that is serializing it. That's what was happening in a different way with Image. They got the book they wanted, 1963, Alan Moore working with 2 of his buddies, Rick Veitch, Steve Bissette, and then we bring in the other buddies, Dave Gibbons, John Toddleben, Don Simpson, but the Image partners want Alan working with them on their books, and that meant that as we got each issue of 63 done, it was getting harder and harder and harder to get the Image partners and our own partner to stay engaged with finishing the project. Like, we had a finish line. Let's just get to that finish line. And we couldn't get to that finish line.
Alan Moore, the belle of the ball, man.
Hey, can't blame Alan, but it was one of the things pulling at him. And the other thing, and I've seen this enough times in comics, you know, you've got a hungry creator working on a project out of love and because they need the income. And when another check comes in from another project, bingo, their attention goes there. So, right. You know, we couldn't compete. We weren't looking to compete with Todd McFarlane, but that's what ended up happening. You know, once the payday came in on those Todd McFarlane Spawn issues with Alan writing one that Todd drew, and then Dave Sim and Frank Miller. Those were bigger payday checks than any of those individuals had ever seen in comics in their lives. And how are you going to keep them down on the farm?
So 1963, it sort of fizzles out. The Jim Lee annual doesn't see the light of day, but Tyrant is on the horizon. You got a good payday from the Image books, and I'm assuming that money went to facilitate your self-publishing venture.
Yeah, Rick and I went through, as you can imagine, or maybe you can't imagine, some hard speed bumps with the end of '63. Adding to the problems were my marriage fell apart at that point in time. I'm still best of friends with my ex-wife, Marlene, but dealing with a marriage falling apart at the same time that I couldn't get the two key players, Alan Moore and Jim Lee, even on the phone to talk to me, was part of the reason I had sent that message out to Alan and Rick saying, look, I'll pencil my part of the annual, but I can't co-edit if I can't get people on the phone. And Rick took that hard, and I can't blame him. He and I were partners in this thing. We had started it, and here was Bissette bailing. But we had an enormous payday on each one of our issues. And both Rick and I knew this was our opportunity to do our own books. And Rick took his bankroll and did his dream comic, which was his dream comic, Roy and Rick's Rarebit Fiends. And my dream comic was Tyrant. I had been trying for, I would say, 10 years to pitch publishers on doing a dinosaur comic. And to me, it was a no-brainer. Like, I was a dinosaur kid. I was one of those kids that my mom taught me to read, by reading me dinosaur books, because that's all I was interested in. And I was the little 3-year-old and 4-year-old that could pronounce the names she couldn't pronounce. And that's how I learned to read. And what frustrated me is there were a lot of comic books I loved because they had dinosaurs in them. The War That Time Forgot and Star Spangled War stories. My all-time favorite Silver Age comic, Kona, Monarch of Monster Isle, that Sam Glanzman drew. But nobody had done a dinosaur comic. Nobody had done a comic without all that clutter, right? Like, in our culture, anytime there's a story involving prehistoric animals, there's like 4 archetypes that kick in. It's either a Lost World story, or it's a time travel story, or it's a prehistoric creature that thaws out from the ice or is genetically created and it goes on a rampage. And the fourth, that almost nobody does, is let's just tell the story of a dinosaur's life, right? Now, I grew up reading books like Black Beauty, Felix Setton's Bambi, Perry, the little squirrel. It's like I grew up reading a lot of animal books. And I loved that first-person nature of those kind of young reader animal books. And every time I tried to pitch my idea for what became Tyrant to a publisher, they would immediately try to shoehorn me in with a writer or convince me to do a science fiction story that would have a dinosaur in it. And I remember even going through it with Fantagraphics at one point where Henry Mayo ended up drawing this backup series for a Fantagraphics book, and it was a series that the writer and the publisher, Gary Groth, and Kim Thompson — I was friends with Kim Thompson, rest his soul, and it drove me nuts because I got the script, and it's like, let's say it was a 10-page backup, and it's like, this is 9 pages of characters in a British drawing room in the 19th century and 1 page of dinosaur. Nah, I'm not interested, I'd done time travel stories. I'd done Lost World stories. And it's like, okay, so you're doing 2/3 of a story with GIs getting to a lost island, and then you get to do 5 pages of dinosaur action, and it's over, right? That, as artists, we often have childish obsessions and interests. I just wanted to draw a fucking dinosaur comic. Thank you very much, right? And to me, the power of telling one animal's life, because I believe, I was raised Catholic. We were told growing up that only human beings have souls. I don't buy it. I've grown up in Vermont, I have seen wild animals do stuff that proves to me those beings have as complete and soulful lives as any one of us people. And we think all our interaction with technology in our houses and our cars and all this shit somehow makes us better. It doesn't. So that was my passion with Tyrant. I wanted to put the reader in the mindset of this amazing animal from the time it is hatched from an egg to the moment it dies. And I know how Tyrant dies. I'm not going to tell you the end of the story because...
Well, you got to finish the comic.
I hope I get to do it, right? So that was the goal with Tyrant, and nobody wanted to let me do it. The closest I got once was with a meeting with, I think it was Mike Richardson and Randy Stradley at some convention. You know, they're with Dark Horse.
Yeah.
And I pitched it to them, and Randy's eyes kind of lit up. He loves a lot of the same monster shit I do. And Mike said, "Oh, we already have a project like that." And, of course, it turned out years later, The Amazing Age of Reptiles, right? And it's a great comic. I have every issue, and Ricardo Delgado is just a great, great, great cartoonist and dinosaur artist. But it still wasn't Tyrant. It still wasn't the story I wanted to tell and the way I wanted to tell it. And I managed to only get 4 issues out, as you know. I finally was self-publishing, truly self-publishing, but I was dealing with, a rough transitional period in my life, and with the collapse of the marriage, and trying to make sure that both of us were there for our kids. They were still preteen and teen. And then the comic book industry imploded in 1995 and 96. The whole thing imploded. I went from having a comic that was selling very well and that I could relist. And for the benefit of your listeners and viewers, relisting means, let's say I got Tyrant number 3 done into the printer. When I listed Tyrant number 3 with Capital Distribution, Diamond Distribution, Fearless, Friendly Franks, Andromeda, all the distributors we had, Titan, I could relist the prior issues, right? If I got Tyrant 4 out, I could relist and sell again to comic shops, Tyrant 1, 2, and 3. So I kept them in print. And I ended up, Tyrant 1 ended up selling about 33,000 copies over 3 print runs. And when you're an independent creator who doesn't have a studio, everything's in your home, and you've got a small overhead, that is viable to continue doing your own work. There was one year where I was able to pay, in January, my entire year's rent, my ex-wife's entire year's rent, and all my key bills in January. So I had a whole year to work on Tyrant, not worrying about keeping a roof over our heads, okay? And that was phenomenal. And that was from my Tyrant earnings alone. And then when distribution imploded, and within about, I'd say 3 to 4 months, we went from having over a dozen distributors we were selling to, we meaning other independent publishers and self-publishers like Rick Beach and so on, to Diamond Comics being the only game in town. I knew the gig was up. I mean, that meant when things happened, you would ship a new issue out. Diamond suddenly changed the rules and said, okay, you can't relist anymore. So it's like, oh, there goes my whole economic model, that when I get Tyrant 5 out, I can relist Tyrant 1 through 4. And retailers liked that because it meant when a new issue was out, they could re-rack those earlier issues. They were making money. I was making money. And the book circulation was steadily growing. And suddenly Diamond was telling independent publishers, no more relisting. It was cutting the legs right out from under us. I also saw a close friend go through a problem with Diamond where they completed their book, they shipped it on time, the book left the print house, arrived in the Diamond warehouses, Diamond lost the pallet, and they refused to pay the self-publisher. And then 4 months later, they found the pallet and went, oh, our mistake. But in the meantime, how did that self-publisher pay their bills, right? That wasn't a problem when you were selling to 12 distributors. If you had a debacle like that with one distributor, you still had the checks from the other distributors coming in. Once there was only one game in town, Diamond Distribution, And that's when I pulled the plug on Tyrant. It was all over. I did manage to get 4 issues out. I did manage to get him out of the egg. But I didn't get him any further. And it really came down to, in the real world terms, I had to choose between my real kids, getting them through the end of high school and their teenage years, or go with my ink kid, my baby dinosaur. For me, there's no choice. I mean, my family always comes first. So that was it. I got a job in the real world. I tried to wing it. I tried to make it go again as a freelancer. When the first job I did for Dark Horse took 6 months to get a paycheck, and the first job I did with DC Comics after Tyrant, they immediately broke their own contract that we had spent a month and a half negotiating. I said, that's it. I can't freelance. If the first 2 freelance jobs I do aren't helping my household keep going, I put all my work time into writing. I had a regular weekly column in a local paper, and my work with the Video Superstore, where I became a co-manager and the buyer. And I thought that was my farewell to comics. I did that last Swamp Thing story, Jack and the Green, that my friend Neil Gaiman scripted, that John Totleben and I did for Midnight Days, that Vertigo anthology of Neil Gaiman work. We were the one new story in that collection. And on the last page, when I turned in the pencils, I wrote in ink on the last panel, "Goodbye," and I signed my name in ink and begged Karen Berger, please make sure this sees print. Like, don't cover it up with the caption box or the credit box or whatever. And Karen was good on her word. And that was my goodbye to American comics right there. That was it. I was done.
Wow. That's
fucking kicker, eh?
So, I'm witnessing that as a fan in real time, and, seeing sort of that implosion of all the distributors in the 90s in comics. And, you weren't the only self-publisher that I was a fan of that sort of like
disappeared.
Yeah, exactly. This was the end for, that was spirits of independence for, people watching at home, where a lot of great cartoonists got into self-publishing at that time and would tour together, and it just really was an exciting time as a fan, because it was like you guys all doing these books that meant a lot to you. You were all great cartoonists at the peak, and then it just collapsed. Like so much of comics did at that time, and it was devastating. From the outside, knowing nothing, it just felt like this is the end of comics, or at least this is the end of the comics as I had known them up to that point.
Right.
And I always wondered about that, like what that experience was like from your perspective, seeing all those distributors go away, and as you've described, the end of the direct market as you had known it up to that point, at least as a working model.
Yeah, it was hard. It was a weird time, and it was hard. And the way we experienced it on our end, I can give you just a 2 or 3, snippets, memories from that time. One of them was, the big distributors, Diamond and Capitol, had trade shows, and the trade shows were really expensive to participate in. It was a few $1,000s, and that's hard for an independent publisher, justifying that. But if you could go, if you could afford transportation, buying the booth, setting up, the benefit of the trade shows were retailers from all around the country came to that show. And you could, you had one-on-one contact with those retailers. And that's how a lot of us kept our work out there and kept healthy relationships with the retailers, right? And I'll never forget the last trade show that Capital City did. I still have some of the memorabilia from it, because to me that was D-Day. That was the end. That was Larry Marder once called Marvel Comics deciding they were going to distribute only through Heroes World, which was the beginning of that collapse. Larry Marder once called that Pearl Harbor, right? And he was right. And when we got to the Capital City trade show, during the trade show, Image Comics was upstairs in negotiations with Capital City. And the survival of Capital City as a distributor was hinging on that meeting. Because what had happened, was that Marvel had gone exclusive with Heroes World, meaning none of the other distributors had the income and revenue any longer from Marvel Comics. And DC and Marvel classically always imitate one another. It's Tweedledum and Tweedledee. So when Marvel went direct with Heroes World, DC announced they were going direct with Diamond. You could only buy DC Comics through Diamond Distribution. And that meant Capital City, who was the most dependable of all the distributors for retailers and for independent publishers, Capital was suddenly doomed. And if Image Comics signed an exclusive with Capital Distribution, there was a hope in hell they might survive. But if Image and Capital didn't come to terms, we all knew, and when I say all, I mean all of us self-publishers, all the retailers in that room, we knew it was over. And sure enough, the word percolated from upstairs. Negotiations had fell apart. Image was going direct with Diamond. That was it. And the heads of Capital Distribution had a talk that night with retailers. And it was so dispiriting that one of the retailers I had great working relationships with was standing about 2 guys away from me. And he turned around at one point and he said, "I'm going home, I'm closing my store, and I'm opening a cigar shop next week." Because it was over. It was over. And the reason it was over is that with a single distributor, it meant that if Diamond messed up, there was no fallback for a comic shop to get their comics from someplace else. And Capital was the only distributor that reliably filled reorders. Okay, Jim, let's say you found a comic you loved and you show it to Ed, and Ed's like, "I want that comic." And Ed, you go to your local shop and they go, "Oh, we sold out of them," right? If that shop only bought comics from Diamond, that shop owner could not guarantee for you that they would get you that comic you wanted. Whereas the Capital shops, the shops that had Capital as their primary or their secondary distributor, could honestly tell you, "Sure, I'll have that book here next week for you," because Capital had a very efficient reorder system. Diamond was only interested in moving new books. They were a volume distributor. Capital understood distribution as a client-friendly business where you want to keep your retailers constantly supplied with the work that actually sells and makes them money. So when Capital was out of the game, it was over. That was it. That Capital trade show, I remember coming home knowing I've got to start planning the end of my my line. I solicited one more issue of Spider Baby comics. I was doing a reprint comic of my older work called Spider Baby Comics. I put out 2 issues. The 3rd issue was ready to go to the printer. I had the cover work done, the production done with Murphy and Murphy Anderson Jr. And it was ready to go to my printer, Print and Litho up in Ontario. And I got the numbers back from Diamond, and they weren't sufficient to even print the book. So that was it. I knew that Tyrant, I might get another year out of it because my sales were good enough. But I wasn't interested in putting my family through another ordeal like that because we'd already been through it with Taboo. I wasn't going to do that to my kids. I wasn't going to do that to myself. So that's how we experienced it on our end. And I also experienced it as a reader because there were a lot of comics I loved that disappeared at that same time. And then there were really tenacious self-publishers who stuck with it. Image reached out to the self-publishing community and said to certain members of the self-publishing community, "How about if we bring your book under our umbrella, sink no hooks into your work contractually or legally, and you're free to leave anytime you want." And Jeff Smith did that with Bone. Colleen Duran did that with A Distant Soil, and there were a number of others who did. But after the experience I'd had with Jim Lee, I had no interest in even pursuing that. Jim Valentino called me personally a couple of times to implore me to stick with it with Tyrant, and I just and the other person I should mention was Joe Linsner. Joe Michael Linsner contacted me. Joe was the one independent comic publisher who reached out to me and said, "Is there anything I can do to help you, stick with it?" And I really appreciated that, and I appreciate it now. But As I say, the bread and butter of keeping two households going during a rough time in our real world life was such that I went, okay, I gotta bail. I'm going to work on something else for a while.
It's understandable. It's just so disappointing when you think of the direction comics have gone. Tyrant feels like it was ahead of its time.
I was just thinking
it should be able to be sold in schools, certainly in libraries. I can imagine collections of Tyrant would have been huge with what has become the new readers of graphic novels. And one interesting thing I noticed in that Comics Journal interview is you talk about format of the pages that you were creating so that they were even scrollable. Like, it just seems so perfect. If it were a slightly different time, or if something could have been a little bit different.
There's a lot of if things had been different. If I had been faster, that was one thing. I mean, I loved doing the work on that book. I joined the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. I became friends with paleontologists that I'm still friends with. I got to visit museums and see not just their displays on the floor, but got to see the fossils that were downstairs in the drawers.
That's so cool.
The process of doing each one of those chapters, each one of those issues, was so much fun for me, and I learned so much. It was like the little, Steve Bissette that wanted to be a paleontologist and ended up becoming a cartoonist, got to spend time with and learn from paleontologists who, when they were kids, wanted to be cartoonists, but ended up being paleontologists, and they got it. They totally understood what I wanted to do and what I was trying to do and what I was doing at that time. But it also meant, an issue like Tyrant #3, the whole issue inside the egg. I'm not just scripting a 22-page comic and drawing it. It's not the kind of schedule I had tried to keep on Swamp Thing. I was researching dinosaur eggs. What was the biology of dinosaur eggs? How does an egg breathe? What do we know about dinosaur eggs? I lucked into so much information around that time that I would pour into the actual issues that each issue for me was like a big learning adventure. My target wasn't the comic shops. My ultimate target was museum stores, right? Every natural history museum at that time had a museum shop. And I was researching what were the distribution models that were in existence for museum stores, because my model is a publisher you may have heard of, or you guys may have already done a segment on this, was a publisher out of San Francisco called Bellerophon Books. And Bellerophon Books is the outfit that does those spinner racks of coloring books that would be sold in museums. And I knew their work because one of my favorite cartoonists, Greg Irons, did a bunch of coloring books for them. He did 2 dinosaur coloring books, a coloring book on whales, another one on pirates. And those books are in print forever, right? They're still in print. Work that Greg Irons did back in the mid-'70s is still sold as coloring books in those racks. And that was kind of, I thought, if my primary platform, my bread and butter platform, are the comic shops, and I was always going to support the shops with the work I was doing, my secondary market, the long-term market, was going to be the museum stores. And later, the way things shook, if I had still been doing it, I would have gone up to Scholastic at some point after I saw what Vijaya was able to negotiate with Bone. But it wasn't to be. It just wasn't to be. The adventure was over once distribution collapsed. I could not bankroll the lifestyle I was enjoying, where I was able to work on Tyrant as a labor of love, as a layman working on a science-based comic where I really tried to learn the science, so I was expressing accurate information through this dramatic narrative, and keep 2 households going and be a good dad. And being a good dad was more important than anything else.
Yeah, can't argue with that, of course. Where does it stand now, Steve? Is it something that you've started work on again, or look at?
About that. I mean, my life, I was done with comics. I figured, okay, I love writing. I write every day. I've got 2 new books out this month as a writer with a British publisher, which I'll reference before we're done, just so I can do my huckster thing. Then the surprise was right the year I left the video business. It was the week of my birthday, and the year was 2005. I was no longer part of the video business. Part of that was because the same thing that happened in distribution in comic books was beginning to happen in the video business. The consolidation, the studios going direct. I was watching the same phenomenon play out in a different way, in a much larger marketplace, because the video market was huge, and now it's gone, right? Video stores disappeared long before what comic shops are facing right now, as the three of us are talking. What happened is that very year, within 2 months, I got a contract with Byron Price. Remember Byron Price?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And Byron Price contracted with me. He wanted to have a trilogy of Swamp Thing novels. And my name came up as a writer. And I contracted with Byron Price. I was going to write 3 novels. And the editor I was working with at Byron Price said, would you illustrate the books as well? And I said, no, why don't you get my buddy John Totleben to illustrate the books? He knew who John Totleben was. But Byron Price didn't know who John Totleben was. In fact, it turned out Byron Price didn't know who I was. It was the editor who had convinced Byron Price that, and once John said, yeah, I'll illustrate the books, the editor went nuts. He was like, well, I'm putting the Swamp Thing team back together, 2 of the guys anyway. And we negotiated the contract. And to make a long story short, I outlined the 3 novels. The outline had to be approved by DC, so I sent the outline to Karen Berger. Karen loved it. She said, this is a great story idea, and it's nothing like anything that's been done in the comics. So DC gave their approval on the premise, and Byron Price balked when it came time to send me the advance to begin the work on the 3 novels. Because, on his own insistence, the contract was for all 3 novels in one contract, right? And the way contracts worked at that time in the publishing world, it's very different now, is they would parse out the advance you would negotiate, right? So you would get a third up front when you signed, you would get a third up front when you delivered the work, and you'd get your final third either when it was published or 6 months after it was published, depending on your agreement. So I signed, and Byron Price said, well, I'm not going to send this writer a third of the advance. That's the whole cost of doing the novel. And the editor called me with tail between their legs saying, Steve, we got a problem. And the editor explained it to me, and I said, well, if Byron's not going to honor his own contract, then I'm not going to start work on the novels. Because he understands that an advance means I can pay my bills while I'm writing his book.
Right.
And within a week, the editor left Byron Price's employ, and the whole project fell apart. And then what happened is James Sturm, who I'd been corresponding with for a time, we were like long-distance friends, got a hold of me. And then James and I and my son Danny all went to an academic comics conference at Bennington College in Bennington, Vermont. And I gave a lecture I'd been giving since the late 80s on the history of horror comics. It was called Journeys into Fear. And I had a short form that was an hour long, and I had a long form that could go on for fucking days in one venue. And James heard my 1-hour version. And after my lecture, he pulled me aside and said, I'm starting a comic school, and I need you. You are exactly the kind of person I need. And he actually had the mock-ups. He had the original art and the mock-ups of the artwork by Seth for the original brochure of the school. And I just remember, wow, I could never pay back Joe Kubert and Muriel Kubert for what they had done for me. But to be on the other side of the classroom and share what I know with the next generation of cartoonists, that's the best payback I can ever give to the next generation of cartoonists. And that's what I've been doing ever since, guys. That was the summer of 2005. We did our first summer workshop. I taught and co-taught those summer workshops, and I've been teaching there since the fall of 2005. And this is why I have not gotten back to work on Tyrant, because my freelance, my creative time is basically May to the end of August, because once the school semester starts, teaching is pretty all-consuming. I don't know if you've ever done it. I highly recommend it. If it suits you, it's a great path in this world. I've been fortunate to work with a wonderful team at the Center for Cartoon Studies. It's one of the best. It is the best employment situation I've ever had in my entire life. But most importantly, getting to work with the new generation of cartoonists year after year. And, it's not just young cartoonists. Our youngest every year are students right out of high school, and our oldest graduate was a 63-year-old archaeologist who I'm still very close friends with, Al Wesolowski.
Oh, you better be.
It's amazing, And so, I have taken the work on Tyrant to the point where I have scripted and done thumbnail breakdowns of 3 new stories. My scheme now is, rather than doing it chronologically, is finding a venue and doing the individual stories as self-standing stories, but they'll all connect. And this allows me to kind of jump around the chronology of Tyrant's life. One story when he's very young, coming out of the nest, another story when he's an older man, so to speak, an older dinosaur. And one old friend of mine, David Lloyd, the co-creator of V for Vendetta, has made it clear that if I want to do it, I can run that material in the online comic anthology that David Lloyd oversees. But every year I've put my creative time into writing projects rather than comic projects, because I still have to bankroll that work myself, right? There's no paycheck up front. There's nobody who's ever come to me. The closest I've come is the great Jim Ottaviani, who's won many awards now with his science-based graphic novels. Was the one publisher who reached out to me once, and we discussed a viable means of my doing Tyrant. But anything that involves 6 months to a year of me ponying up work out of my own pocket, and I come back to, why wouldn't I just self-publish it? Really, I know all the risks, I know the benefits, and if I have to subsidize my own work, then I might as well benefit from my own work. And teaching has been so important to me that that has taken the precedent. And I hope to get back to it. I'm an old man now, and I would love to get back to it. I'm almost at the point of being able to pull Social Security, stop teaching in the foreseeable future, which I'll miss. I'm trying to work out with my friends at the Center for Cartoon Studies how that would work for them, because I don't want to leave them in a lurch. And that may be how I return to Tyrant. But my creative time, because it's such a concentrated period, from May to the end of July each year, I've ended up taking on self-standing projects. I've written a number of books. Cryptid Cinema came out under my own aegis through Amazon as a print-on-demand. I've got 2 new books coming out this month from PS Publications in the UK. The first book is a midnight movie monograph. The editor of the line is a man named Neil Snowden, who I'd done some work for earlier on, a book about the great Nigel Neal, the British television writer who was also a pioneer science fiction horror writer. And the book I've done is on David Cronenberg's The Brood, which is my favorite of David Cronenberg's films. It came out in 1979. And that book, gentlemen, is 700 pages long.
I saw pictures of it, Steve. I think you recently posted pictures of it, and it looks massive, amazing.
On Facebook, so you can go and look at pictures, and you can order it direct from PS Publications. And the second book coming out from them is my first long form of fiction that I got to participate in. I've written short stories in the past. I think I've ended up contributing short stories to a number of anthologies over the years. The one that your listeners and viewers might know would be, I was one of the contributors to the Hellboy Odd Jobs short story collection. And I've got a short story in there called Jigsaw. The new book that's coming out, in fact, it's streeting in 2.5 weeks, is called Studio of Screams. I co-authored it with 4 novelist friends, Mark Morris, Christopher Golden, Tim Lebbins, and the great Stephen Volk, who is a writer whose work I have followed since the 1980s. He's the guy who scripted Gothic, the Ken Russell movie about Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein. And it was a fun project. Studio of Screams was Stephen Volk's idea. And what Mark, Stephen, Chris, and Tim did is they created a fictional British horror film studio, one that never existed. And they each wrote one original novella as if it had been a movie that had been made in England in the 60s or 70s, a horror movie. And Chris Golden was the one of that foursome who said, well, if we're going to do this, we need Steve Bissette. And my job was to write the framing story. I had to concoct a fictional history of this imaginary horror movie studio. And I grew up watching those old horror movies that would have, 5 stories, like Dr. Terror's House of Horrors or Asylum or Tales from the Crypt. And they would always have a framing story that had a twist in the end. So what I did is I came up with a framing story about this retired movie producer being coaxed out of retirement to be interviewed by a college professor. And we find out in the framing story what the master scheme of this movie producer really was. He wasn't really making movies. He was doing something else, and that's all I'll tell you.
Steve, I'm gonna need links to all of this material so that I can put it in the.
Yeah, and I've also, this summer I hope to finish. I've got a second and a third volume of Cryptid Cinema. The second volume will be out before the end of the year, and the third one will probably be next year. So, I hope to get back to Tyrant, but writing ended up being far more pleasurable for me. And unlike drawing, I don't know about you guys, but when I'm going to work on a comic story, I've got to shut the whole world down. I just need to be alone in my studio. But I can write anywhere, anytime. And if I only have 5 minutes, I'll put in 5 minutes on writing. And if I have 2 hours or 4 hours or a whole day, I'll put in time writing. But when I'm doing my comics work, I really need to it's almost like I just have to make that bubble around me. And it means that when I re-engage with Tyrant, I'm really going to want to just put the whole world at arm's length. And given what we're all dealing with a pandemic right now, might happen sooner than later, my friends.
Steve, it's almost embarrassing how little has changed in my day-to-day, I got to say, man, with recent events.
Right?
It's like we've been training for this.
Yeah, it's like we were preparing for it. And on top of that, I've been reading apocalyptic science fiction since I was 5. So it's like, whoa. And I'm not making light of the situation. People are sick.
We're laughing to keep from crying, man.
Well, we're in a profession. One of the things we can honestly tell our students and our graduates is, this is one of the few professions where I used to do theater in high school and college. We don't even need the performance space. What the three of us are doing right now is about as much performance as a cartoonist ever gets to do.
I'm sitting 2 feet away from Jim right now because he's the last person I've seen since last week. I haven't seen anybody else for 8 days.
My wife and I we're into our 4th week. Because we started early. We could see where it was going. And I got to say, living in Vermont, we got one tiny country store that dependably has vegetables and dairy product, which is the only reason I got to go out for the grocery once a week or so. And we've got the post office. And the hardest thing has been breaking my post office habit. I only go in twice a week instead of every day. So that's been hard.
Steve, it's been a beautiful talk, nice conversation. I appreciate your time a lot, but we have to do it again because there's a lot that I want to talk to you about just the new models of publishing that you see with Amazon and all of
sure.
that. That's a whole new kettle of fish, man. But we've been at it for about 3.5.
I'll put you in touch with and encourage you to talk with Rick Veitch, because out of all my direct circle of friends, Rick has been doing the most using print on demand to do his new comics work. In fact, he just this past week shipped his new Boy Max Immortal.
Yes.
So I think Rick has done 6 books so far. Graphic novels, small graphic novels, and continuing Max Immortal and Rare Bit Fiends. And that, for me, is the role model of continuing. I'll leave you with this. I didn't learn the computer skills that my friends like Rick Beach did, right?
Right.
I fought it. I'm old school. I want to go in my studio and come back with ink all over me, or I don't feel like I did anything.
Right.
I still have the steep learning curve ahead of me of being able to design books and get them ready for print. I've been paying book designers to do that work, and they've been great. You know, friends like Mark Mastel and friends like Tim Paxton have done terrific work, and I've made sure that they accept money for their time and their work. But I do look on someone like Rick Beach with, a little bit of envy, because Rick in his studio can actually get his comics work all the way up to publication. And I still have that learning curve ahead of me. In the last week, I've learned how to do Zoom and teach online and use Google Hangouts. So I know I'm capable of it. But I just got to get my ass in the saddle, Jim and Ed. And I also have to make that monumental monetary commitment to buying what would be necessary to do that, which has been one of the things holding me back too. So
I encourage you to do it so much, Steve. It is, make a fanzine, like do some relatively small thing to get your foot in the water. But the designing of like a book, it's incredible. Like I've gone from, my background was in print to doing all this digital stuff, and the freedom it's as exciting to me as what I do in ink. And I don't just mean drawing, but the actual preparation of like building a publication, page by page.
Yeah.
There's a lot of creative fun to be had in that.
Oh,
and with these print-on-demand models, it is probably the future.
I do my own boards and everything for, a lot of Tyron, I did all my paste ups and all my typesetting and all my prep. So I know there's a great deal of fun in the process. I've been one of those Luddites that from the start was like, no, I just want to be at my drawing board, And now I'm not paying the price by paying the price. So
I'm glad you said all that about Veach, putting his work together and all of that, man, because I hit him up and I said, man, we do these conversations over Skype. He's like, oh, I don't know how that works or something like that, man. So we're going to use this video as evidence that he could probably...
Not only that, we'll end with this. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, I know by the time this is up, it will have happened.
April 2nd.
Right, on April 2nd, 3 o'clock on a Thursday, Rick Veach is becoming Vermont's 4th cartoon laureate. And to do that, because of the current pandemic, Rick has had to learn Zoom, Google Hangout, and all that shit, because we're doing it virtual online because nobody can go to the State House in Montpelier because they've closed it. So the Rick Veach of Friday, April 3rd, will be ready to engage with the Piscor Rug team, finally.
Good to know, man. You narked him out.
There you go.
It's on record, man.
But I encourage you to do it, because Rick is doing the most brilliant work of his career, in a career full of brilliant work right now, and he's self-publishing it, and it's coming out through Amazon. And just as all of us have found who have done print on demand, all the people that have been saying for years, we want to see your new work, don't necessarily line up to buy it when it's available. So get out there and support it. If you're a Rick Veach fan, the work's out there waiting for you to pick up, and it arrives right at your door. You don't have to do anything. So
we're going to put links to the books under the video. We can also put links to any social media you may have if you want to call some things out for the audio listeners.
Yep. Guys, you've been great. I love what you do, as I said at the beginning, and that's not my brown nosing. There's clips I use from your sessions in the classroom, so keep it up. You're doing great work. And the comics you create are great, too. I mean, diehard Street Angel fans sitting right here. So.
Well, thanks so much, Stephen. Thanks for talking with us. Really appreciate the time, and hopefully we'll do this again soon.
And I'm gonna end it like that one famous PSA from the 1980s. We learned it from watching you.
Indeed.
You poor bastards.